The Iron Duke stood alone in the war room as dawn broke over Blackmore, his shadow cutting across maps stained with the blood of forgotten campaigns. Outside, the northern wind screamed like something dying, and inside, the silence held the weight of betrayal. This is a story about power that devours everything, about a man who ruled kingdoms but couldn't hold on to the one thing that mattered. If you want to see how empires crumble when the heart finally speaks louder than the throne, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments, hit that like button, because what's coming will redefine everything you thought you knew about control and consequence. Cassian Vale learned about death before he learned about mercy. He was 9 years old when his father dragged him to the courtyard of their ancestral estate and forced him to watch as 3 men were hanged for stealing grain during the famine. The bodies swung in the winter wind, and his father's hand gripped the back of his neck hard enough to bruise. "Your compassion will kill more people than your cruelty ever will," his father said. "Remember that." Cassian remembered. 23 years later, he stood in the same courtyard, now Duke of the Northern Borderlands, watching a different kind of execution. This one was bureaucratic, bloodless, but no less final. The crown's emissary read the decree with the mechanical efficiency of someone who delivered death sentences before breakfast. By order of King Aldrich III, Duke Cassian Vale is hereby commanded to formalize the union between House Vale and House Varric through marriage to Lady Selene Varric, daughter of Grand Chancellor Theron Varric, to be completed within 6 lunar cycles. The words hung in the frozen air like smoke. Cassian didn't flinch. His face remained the same carved granite that had earned him the name Iron Duke across 8 provinces. But his fingers, hidden behind his back, curled into fists tight enough that his nails drew blood from his palms. The emissary, a weasel-faced man named Corbin, rolled up the parchment with exaggerated care. He was enjoying this, Cassian realized. Enjoying the spectacle of watching a man known for breaking enemy formations with his bare hands being brought to heel by words on paper. "His Grace understands the crown's generous offer," Corbin said, and the word generous dripped with mockery. "His Grace understands that this is a noose disguised as a necklace," Cassian replied, his voice flat and cold. "But tell the king I will consider his request with the seriousness it deserves." "It's not a request, Your Grace. Everything is a request until someone starts bleeding." The emissary's smile faltered. He'd heard the stories about the Iron Duke, about what happened to the Kethrin rebels who tried to ambush his convoy 3 winters ago. They found pieces of the insurgents scattered across 2 miles of forest road, and Cassian had walked back into Blackmore without a drop of blood on his uniform. "The crown expects your answer within the fortnight," Corbin said, backing toward his horse. "The crown will get it when I'm ready to give it." Cassian watched the emissary ride through the gates of Blackmore, his horse kicking up mud that had frozen solid overnight. Then he turned and walked back into his fortress, where the real war was waiting. The obsidian halls of Blackmore were designed to intimidate. Every surface reflected and distorted, creating the illusion that you were being watched from multiple angles simultaneously. The floors were polished black stone that clicked under boot heels, like counting down to something terrible. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting Vale victories going back 6 generations, each one soaked in imagery of conquest and domination. Cassian hated every inch of it. He climbed the spiral staircase to his private study, a room that occupied the highest point of the eastern tower. Up here, away from the performance of court, he could almost breathe. Almost. His war council was already assembled when he entered. 4 men who had bled with him in the border campaigns, who understood that loyalty was earned in trenches and sealed with shared trauma. Torvin Blackwood, his oldest friend and the captain of his personal guard, stood by the window watching the morning fog roll across the battlements. Torvin was built like siege equipment, all muscle and scar tissue, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts after a particularly brutal bar fight. "Let me guess," Torvin said without turning around. "The crown wants you married off like a broodmare." "The Grand Chancellor wants a leash on the north," Cassian corrected. "The marriage is just the collar." Elias Crane, his spy master, sat in the corner sharpening a knife that was already sharp enough to split hair. Elias was thin and forgettable, the kind of man who could disappear in a crowd of 3 people. That's what made him dangerous. Selene Varric is 22 years old, educated at the Imperial Academy, fluent in 7 languages, and utterly devoted to her father's ambitions, Elias said, not looking up from his blade. "She's not stupid, which makes her more dangerous than half the assassins I've dealt with. Can we refuse? Asked Garrett Stone, the youngest of the council and the most idealistic. He still believed that rules mattered, that honor was something other than a word people used before they stabbed you. We can refuse, Cassian said, pouring himself a glass of dark wine that tasted like burnt oak. And then the crown can declare me in rebellion, strip my titles, and send the southern legions to reduce Blackmore to ash. So yes, technically, we can refuse. What's the play? Torvin asked. The same play it's always been. We delay, we maneuver, we find leverage. And if there's no leverage to find, then we create it. Cassian drained the wine in one swallow. It burned going down, which felt appropriate. Everything burned these days. There's another complication, Elias said quietly. Of course there is. Lady Isolda was seen entering the physician's wing yesterday evening, alone. The room went silent except for the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Cassian's hand tightened around the empty glass. Get out! All of you. Your Grace, I said get out. They left without argument because they'd learned years ago that when Cassian's voice dropped to that particular frequency, you didn't ask questions. You just moved. When the door closed, Cassian set down the glass very carefully, as if it might shatter from the force of his thoughts alone. Then he walked to the window and stared out at the northern wastes, where the sky was the color of old bruises, and the horizon disappeared into nothing. Isolda. Her name was a wound he kept reopening. They'd met 2 years ago during a trade negotiation with the Eastern merchants. She'd been part of the delegation, a minor noblewoman with no real power or influence, there to smile and look decorative while the men discussed tariffs and shipping routes. Cassian had barely noticed her at first. He was busy calculating profit margins and identifying which merchants were trying to cheat him. But then she'd spoken. The Eastern Silk Route is vulnerable to bandit raids between the Kethrin Pass and the Gorvan checkpoint, she'd said, her voice calm and precise. You're offering standard protection rates, but standard rates assume standard risk. The Eastern merchants are paying for security they're not receiving. Either increase the guard presence or adjust the tariff accordingly. Every head at the table turned to stare at her. The lead merchant, a fat man named Dorian, who smelled like expensive oils and cheap wine, had laughed. The lady knows about trade routes now? How charming. The lady knows how to read shipping manifests and casualty reports, Isolda replied without raising her voice, which is apparently more than can be said for some people at this table. Cassian had looked at her then, really looked, and what he saw made something shift in his chest that felt dangerously close to interest. She wasn't beautiful in the traditional court sense. Her features were too sharp, too severe. Her eyes were the color of winter steel, and they didn't soften when she smiled. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that was practical rather than fashionable, and she wore minimal jewelry, as if she understood that decorations were just targets. The merchant delegation left angry but poorer, which was how Cassian preferred his negotiations to end. And Isolda had stayed behind, gathering her papers with the methodical precision of someone who treated documents like weapons. You made an enemy today, Cassian told her. I made several, she replied. It was a productive afternoon. He'd smiled then, a real smile, which was rare enough that Torvin later asked if he was feeling ill. Walk with me, Cassian said. Is that a request or a command, Your Grace? Does it matter? Yes. Then it's a request. She'd studied him for a moment, those winter eyes cataloging and calculating. Then she'd nodded once and followed him out into the gardens, where the roses grew in spite of the northern cold, sustained by some gardener's stubborn refusal to accept botanical limitations. They walked in silence for a while, and Cassian found himself appreciating the fact that she didn't feel the need to fill empty air with empty words. Most people talked when they were nervous. Isolda just observed. You're not afraid of me, he said finally. Should I be? Most people are. Most people are idiots. He laughed, actually laughed, and it felt like something rusty and unused cracking back to life. They'd talked until sunset, and then past sunset, until the servants came to light the torches and the night insects began their mechanical screaming. She told him about growing up in a minor house in the eastern provinces, about learning early that intelligence was more valuable than beauty, because beauty faded, but intelligence could be sharpened. He told her about the border campaigns, about learning that war was mostly logistics and boredom punctuated by moments of pure terror. When they finally parted, He'd felt something he hadn't felt since before his father died. Hope, maybe. Or the beginning of it. That was 2 years ago. Now, standing in his study with the crown's marriage decree burning a hole in his future and Isolda's name hanging in the air like smoke, Cassian understood that hope was just another word for vulnerability, and vulnerability was death. He found her in the lower archives, which didn't surprise him. Isolda spent more time among the old records than she did in the glittering chaos of court. She said the dead kept better secrets than the living. She also said the past was more honest than the present, because the past had already decided who won and who lost. She was sitting at a wooden desk scarred with centuries of use, surrounded by scrolls and ledgers that smelled like dust and forgotten promises. A single candle provided the only light, casting her shadow across the stone wall in a way that made her look like she was being erased. "You're avoiding the court," Cassian said from the doorway. "The court is a cesspool of ambition and desperation. I prefer the company of corpses." He walked into the room and sat across from her, his armor making soft metallic sounds as he moved. Up close he could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her shoulders carried weight that shouldn't be there. "Elias told me you visited the physician. Elias should learn to keep his mouth shut. He's paid to know things. And you're paying him to spy on me now? I'm paying him to know everything that happens in this fortress. You knew that when you came here?" She set down the quill she'd been using and met his eyes directly. The candlelight turned her irises into chips of fractured ice. "What do you want, Cassian?" "I want to know if you're sick." "I'm not sick." "Then why—" "I'm pregnant." The words hit him like a crossbow bolt to the chest. For a moment, the world narrowed to just those 2 syllables, and everything else became background noise. The distant sound of guards changing shifts, the whisper of wind through the archive vents, the mechanical scratch of a rat moving through the walls. "How long have you known?" he asked, and his voice sounded strange even to himself. 3 weeks. I wanted to be certain before I said anything, and you're certain now. The physician confirmed it yesterday. Cassian stood up and walked to the narrow window that looked out over the eastern courtyard. Below, servants moved through their routines like pieces on a game board, unaware that the entire structure of power they lived under was about to collapse. "This changes everything," he said. "Does it?" He turned to look at her. "You know it does. I know that you've been summoned to marry the Grand Chancellor's daughter. I know that this fortress is a cage disguised as a castle. I know that I'm a variable in an equation you didn't plan for. You're not a variable." "Then what am I?" The silence stretched between them like a battlefield. "You're the only thing in this entire kingdom that isn't a transaction," he said finally. "The only thing that doesn't come with conditions and clauses." She stood up slowly, the movement careful and deliberate. "And what happens when conditions and clauses become unavoidable? What happens when you have to choose between what you want and what you need?" "I'll find a way." "You'll find a way to do what?" "Cassian, there is no middle ground here. Either you marry Celine Varick and secure the treaty, or you refuse and watch the crown turn the north into a graveyard. Those are the options. Those are the options they've given us. That doesn't mean they're the only options available." She walked toward him, close enough that he could see the individual threads of silver in her dark hair, close enough that he could smell the lavender oil she used. "I need you to understand something," she said quietly. "I didn't tell you this to make your decision harder. I told you because you deserve to know. But I'm not going to be the reason you destroy everything you've built. You're not destroying anything. Not yet. But give it time." She moved to leave, but he caught her wrist gently. His hand completely encircled it, a reminder of the physical disparity between them, of how easily strength could become violence if you let it. "Don't disappear on me," he said. "I'm right here." "That's not what I mean. I know what you mean." She pulled away, not roughly but with finality, and walked toward the archive exit. At the doorway, she paused and looked back at him. "The crown will have its answer soon," she said. "Make sure it's one you can live with." Then she was gone, and Cassian was alone with the dust and the dead, and the terrible weight of choices that felt less like freedom and more like different flavors of surrender. The next 2 weeks passed like a slow-motion siege. Cassian threw himself into the machinery of governance, approving grain distributions, settling border disputes, reviewing military deployments. He worked 16-hour days, pushing his body until exhaustion became a kind of anesthetic. At night, he dreamed of crossroads and burning bridges. Isolda avoided him with the skill of someone who understood architecture and human patterns. She attended court functions when required, but positioned herself in the background, always within sight but never within conversation range. When their eyes met across crowded rooms, hers were unreadable, neutral, giving away nothing. The court began to notice. Rumors started small, whispers in corners and speculation over wine. Lady Isolda looked pale. The Duke seemed distracted. Had anyone seen them together recently? The gossip grew like mold, spreading through the social structure of Blackmore with the inevitability of infection. Torvin cornered him in the training yard on the 10th day after the Crown's decree. "You're going to have to make a decision," he said, handing Cassian a practice sword. "I've made plenty of decisions, not about this." They circled each other in the dirt ring where Cassian had learned to fight as a boy. The morning was cold enough that their breath came out in clouds, and the impact of blade on blade rang out across the empty yard. "The Chancellor is sending representatives next week," Torvin said between strikes. "They'll want a formal answer. Then they'll get one." "What answer?" "The one I'm still figuring out." Torvin attacked high. Cassian parried and countered low. They'd been fighting together for so long that it was more like choreography than combat, a conversation conducted in movement and force. "You can't marry Celine and keep Isolda," Torvin said bluntly. "The math doesn't work." "I'm aware of the math." "Then what's the plan?" "The plan is to buy time." "Time for what?" "Time to find the Chancellor's weakness. Every man has one. I just need to locate his. And if you can't, then I'll create one." They fought in silence for a while, the rhythm of attack and defense providing structure to thoughts that refused to organize themselves. Finally, Torvin stepped back and lowered his sword. "I've known you since we were children," he said. "I've watched you make impossible decisions and live with impossible consequences. But this is different. How? Because before, you only had yourself to protect. Now you have someone else. Actually, you have two someone else's." The weight of that truth settled over Cassian like armor that didn't fit anymore. "What would you do?" he asked. Torvin smiled grimly. "I'd burn the entire kingdom down and build something new from the ashes. But I'm not the one wearing the crown. You are. And crowned heads make different choices than free men." "We're not free," Cassian said. "None of us are. We're just pretending the chains are ornamental." "Then maybe it's time to stop pretending." The formal reception for the Chancellor's delegation was held in the Great Hall of Blackmore on a night when the northern wind made the fortress sound like it was screaming. Chandeliers of burning crystal hung from iron chains, throwing fractured light across marble floors polished to mirror shine. The assembled nobility wore their wealth like armor, jewels and silk, and expressions of calculated ambition. Cassian stood at the head of the hall in full ceremonial dress, the kind of outfit that weighed 20 pounds and turned you into a symbol rather than a person. The veil crest was embroidered across his chest in silver thread, a wolf's head with its jaws open in permanent attack. Lady Celine Varick entered with the practiced grace of someone who'd been trained since birth to command attention. She was objectively beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, all symmetry and polish and the kind of perfection that came from generational wealth and selective breeding. Her dress was midnight blue silk that probably cost more than most families earned in a year, and she wore the Grand Chancellor's colors as a deliberate reminder of whose daughter she was. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They were dark and bright and completely ruthless. The eyes of someone who understood that marriage was warfare conducted through legal documents. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying with exact precision. "I bring greetings from my father and the king." "My lady," Cassian replied, bowing just enough to satisfy protocol without implying submission. "Blackmore welcomes you." The formalities proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Introductions were made, wine was served, musicians played compositions designed to fill silence without demanding attention. The court watched everything with the focused intensity of people waiting for blood. Isolda was there, positioned near the eastern pillar where the light didn't quite reach. She wore gray, the color of someone trying to disappear, and she kept her eyes fixed on the middle distance as if the entire spectacle was happening to someone else. Cassian felt her presence like a second heartbeat. The Grand Chancellor's chief advisor, a skeletal man named Vesper, who looked like he'd been assembled from coat hangers and malice, stepped forward with a scroll. "The Crown is pleased to announce the formal betrothal between Duke Cassian Vale of Blackmore and Lady Celine Varick, daughter of Grand Chancellor Theron Varric, Vesper read in a voice like coins falling on stone. The union will be celebrated 8 weeks hence, binding the northern and central provinces in alliance and prosperity. The hall erupted in applause that sounded like rain on tin roofs. Cassian looked at Selene. She looked back with an expression that said she knew exactly what game they were playing and was confident she'd already won. Then he looked past her, across the sea of faces and false smiles, to where Isolda stood against the pillar. For just a moment their eyes met, and in that fraction of a second, he saw something he'd never seen before in her winter gaze. Surrender. Not to him, not to the situation, but to the fundamental truth that some battles can't be won no matter how hard you fight. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is recognize when you've already lost. She turned and walked toward the exit, her gray dress disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the hall. No one noticed except Cassian, because everyone else was too busy celebrating an alliance that would reshape the political landscape of the North. He wanted to follow her. Every instinct screamed at him to abandon this circus and go after the only person in the entire fortress who saw him as something other than a game piece. But he was trapped in the machinery of ceremony, locked into a performance he couldn't escape without turning the entire court into an audience for his rebellion. So he stayed. He drank wine with Selene and her delegation. He accepted congratulations from nobles who hated him but feared him more. He smiled and nodded and played the role of the Iron Duke, accepting his fate with grace and dignity. And with every second that passed, he felt Isolda slipping further away. She was gone by morning. Cassian discovered it when Torvin knocked on his chamber door at dawn, his face the color of old ash. "Her room is empty," Torvin said. "Clothes are gone. Personal effects, gone. It's like she was never here." Cassian was already moving, pulling on clothes and boots with the mechanical speed of someone who'd dressed for battle 1,000 times. He strode through the halls of Blackmore with Torvin following, their footsteps echoing off obsidian walls. Isolda's chambers were in the south wing, a modest suite that she'd chosen specifically because it was away from the main court traffic. Cassian pushed open the door and stepped into emptiness. The room had been stripped methodically. The bed was made with military precision. The desk was clear. The wardrobe stood open and vacant. On the small table by the window, there was a single piece of paper held down by a smooth river stone. Cassian picked up the note. The handwriting was Isolda's, elegant and precise. "Some choices are made for you long before you realize you're choosing. I won't be the reason you lose everything. Find me if you can live with what it costs." He read it 3 times, and each time the words meant something slightly different but equally devastating. "When?" he asked Torvin. "Sometime between the 3rd and 4th watch." The gate guard saw a hooded figure leave on horseback, but they didn't stop her because she had the proper exit documentation. Documentation she shouldn't have been able to forge. "She had help," Torvin said carefully. "From who?" "Elias thinks maybe someone in the lower administration. Someone who owed her a favor or shared her politics. Find them." Already looking. Cassian walked to the window and stared out at the northern wilderness, where the mountains rose like broken teeth and the sky was the color of old iron. Somewhere out there, Isolda was running, pregnant and alone, into territory that could kill experienced soldiers. "Assemble the scout regiment," he said. "Full provisions, light armor, fast horses. Your Grace, the court will notice if you leave during the betrothal period. I don't care what the court notices. The Chancellor will interpret this as an insult. The Chancellor can interpret it however he wants. I'm going after her." Torvin was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the gesture carrying all the weight of loyalty that transcended politics. "How many men?" 10. The best trackers we have. And if we find her, then we bring her home. And if she doesn't want to come home," Cassian turned away from the window and met his oldest friend's eyes. "Then I'll burn down whatever world she's trying to escape to until the only safe place left is with me." Whoa. They rode out at noon under a sky that looked like it was considering violence. Cassian led the regiment himself, pushing the horses hard across frozen ground that rang like struck metal. Behind him rode Torvin and 8 men who'd killed for him in the border wars and would kill for him again without asking questions. The trail was cold but not invisible. Isolda had ridden north toward the mining settlements and forgotten townships where the Crown's authority dissolved into suggestion. It was smart. The northern territories were a maze of hidden valleys and abandoned roads, places where you could disappear if you knew how. and Isolde knew how. They pushed through the first day without stopping, covering ground that would have taken a normal party 3 days to traverse. Cassian barely felt the exhaustion. His body was running on something older than adrenaline, something primal that lived in the part of the brain that didn't understand consequences. On the second day, they found the first sign. A burnt-out campsite in a hollow between two hills. The fire still warm enough to leave ash on your fingers. Someone had been here recently, and they'd left in a hurry. One person, said Kyle, the regiment's best tracker. Small boot prints, lightweight, moving fast but not panicked. How far ahead? 6 hours, maybe 8? Can we close that gap? If we don't stop for the night, then we don't stop. They rode through darkness, following traces that were more intuition than evidence. Cassian felt time collapsing around him, every hour drawing him closer to something he couldn't name but recognized anyway. Certainty, maybe. Or the edge of a decision that had been building for 2 years. The blizzard hit on the third day. It came from the north like a living thing, turning the world into white static. Visibility dropped to arm's length. The temperature fell so fast that moisture froze on their exposed skin. The horses stumbled and slowed, their breath coming in labored clouds. "We need to find shelter," Torvin shouted over the wind. "The men won't last another hour in this." "Keep moving," Cassian shouted back. "Your Grace! That's an order!" They pushed forward into whiteness that erased everything, where direction became theoretical and survival became statistical. 2 of the horses went down, their riders forced to continue on foot. The regiment began to string out, the strongest pulling ahead while the weakest fell behind. Cassian felt ice forming in his lungs with every breath. His hands were numb inside his gloves. His face was a mask of frozen skin stretched over bone. But he kept moving, because stopping meant accepting that Isolda was lost, and acceptance was surrender, and surrender was death. Then Kyle, who'd moved ahead as a forward scout, came stumbling back through the snow. "There's a structure ahead," he gasped. "Maybe a quarter mile. Looks like an old mining outpost." Cassian didn't wait for further details. He pushed forward, dragging his horse through drifts that came up to his thighs. The outpost materialized out of the white like a ghost becoming solid. A low building made of stone and timber that looked like it had been fighting the mountain for 100 years and losing. The door was barricaded from the inside. Cassian hammered on it with his fist. "Open up! We're not raiders!" Silence. Then a voice from inside, muffled but clear. "Go away." He knew that voice. "Isolda," he shouted. "Open the door! I said go away. I'm not leaving. Then you'll freeze. I'll break down the door first." There was a long pause. Then the sound of something heavy being moved. The door cracked open, and Isolda looked out at him with eyes that were red from crying or cold or both. "You shouldn't have come," she said. "Too late," he replied. She stepped back and let them in. The interior of the outpost was barely warmer than the storm outside, but at least the wind couldn't reach them here. Cassian's men collapsed on the floor, shaking with exhaustion and cold. Torvin immediately started organizing, distributing what little rations they had left, checking for frostbite, preparing defenses in case the shelter became a siege point. Isolda stood in the corner, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing that looked like she'd stolen them from 3 different people. Her face was thinner than Cassian remembered, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut, and there was something in her posture that reminded him of cornered animals. "We need to talk," Cassian said. "No, we don't. Isolda, you were supposed to let me go." "That was the point. I removed myself from the equation so you could make the necessary choice without guilt or complication." "Is that what you think this is? A complication?" She laughed, and it sounded like breaking glass. "What else would you call it? I'm pregnant with your child while you're betrothed to the Grand Chancellor's daughter. That's not a complication, that's a catastrophe." He crossed the small space between them in 2 strides. Up close, he could see the toll the last 3 days had taken. The bruised shadows under her eyes, the split in her lower lip from the cold, the way her hand shook when she thought he wasn't looking. "Why didn't you tell me you were leaving?" he asked quietly. "Because you would have tried to stop me." "Damn right I would have." "And then what? You'd keep me locked in Blackmore like a secret you're ashamed of? Watch me grow heavy with a child you can't acknowledge while you play house with Celine Varick." The words hit him like physical blows, each one precisely placed for maximum damage. "I was working on a solution," he said. "There is no solution, Cassian. Don't you understand that? This isn't a military campaign where you can outmaneuver your opponents. This is politics at the highest level. and the rules are written in blood and tradition. You can't win this fight. Watch me." She shook her head slowly. "I can't watch you destroy yourself trying to save me. I won't do that to you. You don't get to make that choice." "Yes, I do. That's the whole point." Before he could respond, Kael appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Your Grace, we have a problem." "What now?" "Tracks outside, fresh. Someone's been circling the outpost." "How many?" "At least 4, maybe more." Cassian felt every instinct snap into combat mode. He turned to Torvin. "Defensive positions, weapons ready." The men moved with practiced efficiency, taking up positions at the narrow windows and reinforcing the barricaded door. Cassian drew his sword, the metal singing as it cleared the scabbard. Isolda grabbed his arm. "Who's out there?" "I don't know yet, but you have a guess." He met her eyes. "The Grand Chancellor doesn't leave loose ends. If he knows you're carrying my child, he'll consider you a threat to his alliance." Her face went pale. "He sent assassins." "Probably." "How did he even know?" Elias was right. "You had help escaping. Someone in the lower administration. Someone who either sold you out or got compromised." Isolda sank down onto the rough bench against the wall. "So I ran straight into a trap." "No. You ran into me. And I've dealt with worse than hired killers." The building shook as something heavy slammed into the door. Once. Twice. The barricade held, but Cassian could hear wood beginning to splinter. Torvin looked at him. "Orders?" Cassian raised his voice so every man could hear him. "Anyone comes through that door dies. No prisoners. No mercy. Understood?" "Understood," they replied in unison. The third impact broke through the barricade. The door flew open, and men poured in wearing dark leather and carrying weapons that were designed for efficiency rather than honor. Cassian counted 6 before the fighting started, which meant his earlier estimate was wrong, and the situation was worse than he'd calculated. But worse was something he understood. The first attacker came at him with a short sword, the blade designed for close quarters work. Cassian parried and countered, his own sword opening the man's throat in one clean motion. Blood sprayed across the stone floor, black in the dim light. Behind him, his men engaged with the practiced violence of soldiers who'd learned that hesitation was death. Steel rang on steel. Men screamed. The close confines of the outpost turned the fight into something primal and vicious. Cassian fought with the cold precision that had earned him his reputation. No wasted movement, no unnecessary flourishes, just efficient application of force in the service of survival. 2 more attackers went down before they understood what they were facing, that the Iron Duke wasn't a political figurehead, but a weapon that happened to wear a crown. Then he saw the 7th man. This one was different, older, scarred, moving with the economy of someone who killed people for a living and was very good at it. A professional, not just hired muscle. The assassin locked eyes with Cassian and smiled. Then he moved, not toward the Duke, but toward the corner where Isolda stood pressed against the wall. Cassian's heart stopped. He threw himself across the room, abandoning defense in favor of speed. The assassin's blade was already arcing toward Isolda when Cassian's sword intercepted it, metal screaming against metal. The force of the impact sent shockwaves up both their arms. They fought in a space barely large enough for one person, let alone 2 men trying to kill each other. The assassin was fast, technically perfect, the kind of fighter who'd been trained in one of the Crown's shadow schools. But Cassian had something the assassin didn't. He had everything to lose. Their blades became a blur of motion, attack, and counterattack happening faster than thought. Cassian felt the assassin's sword slice across his shoulder, felt hot blood running down his arm. Didn't matter. He pressed forward, driving the assassin back, matching technique with raw aggression. The killing blow came when the assassin's foot caught on a loose stone. Just a moment of imbalance, barely a fraction of a second. But Cassian had been waiting for exactly that kind of opening his entire life. His sword took the assassin through the heart, the blade punching through leather and bone with terrible finality. The man's eyes widened in surprise, as if death was something he'd never quite expected to happen to him personally. Cassian pulled his sword free and let the body fall. Around him the fighting was ending. His men stood over corpses, bleeding and shaking but alive. Torvin was wrapping a wound on his forearm, his face grim. Kael was checking the bodies, making sure none of them were pretending to be dead. Cassian turned to Isolda. She was staring at the blood on his uniform, her face the color of old snow. When she looked up at him, there were tears on her cheeks, and he realized he'd never seen her cry before. "You're hurt," she said. "It's not deep. You're bleeding. I've bled before." She stood up slowly and crossed to him, her hand shaking as she reached for his wounded shoulder. The touch was gentle, careful, completely at odds with the violence that had just filled the room. "Why?" she whispered. "Why didn't you just let me go?" "Because some things matter more than strategy," he said. "Some things you don't calculate. You just fight for them. Even if it destroys you, especially then." Outside, the blizzard screamed like something dying, and inside, surrounded by bodies and blood and the wreckage of every careful plan he'd ever made. Cassian understood that he'd just crossed a line there was no coming back from. The Grand Chancellor would interpret this as war. The Crown would see it as rebellion. His carefully maintained alliance with the southern provinces would collapse. Everything he'd built over the last decade would burn. And standing there with Isolda's hands on his bleeding shoulder and her tears on his armor, Cassian realized he didn't care. Let it burn, he thought. Let the whole kingdom burn. I'm done playing their game. But what he said out loud was simpler. We need to move. More will come. Isolda nodded, still crying, still holding on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. Where do we go? She asked. North, he said. Past the crown's reach. Past the chancellor's influence. Somewhere they can't follow. And then what? Then we figure out how to survive. It wasn't much of a plan. It was barely a plan at all. But it was all he had. And sometimes all you had was enough if you were willing to bet everything on it. They left the outpost as the storm began to clear, riding into wilderness that promised nothing except the possibility of living long enough to see tomorrow. Behind them, the bodies grew cold and the blood froze into dark ice. And somewhere in the southern provinces, in the marble halls of the Grand Chancellor's estate, a report would be written and delivered that would change the political landscape of the entire kingdom. The Iron Duke has broken his oath. The North is in open rebellion, and the woman he chose over duty is carrying the air that could fracture the realm. The game had changed. The rules had been thrown out. And Cassian Vale, the man who'd spent his entire life calculating every move 3 steps ahead, had finally made a choice based on something other than strategy. He'd chosen her, and the cost of that choice was going to be measured in kingdoms. The northern wilderness didn't care about politics or bloodlines or the weight of crowns. It just killed indiscriminately. Cassian pushed his remaining men through terrain that looked like the gods had gotten angry and forgotten to clean up afterward. Jagged rock formations rose from snow-covered ground like broken bones. The wind carried ice particles that felt like being sandblasted. The temperature had dropped so low that breathing hurt, each inhalation scraping the inside of his lungs raw. Isolda rode behind him, wrapped in furs they'd stripped from the dead assassins. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the outpost 6 hours ago. Cassian could feel her silence like a physical weight pressing against his spine. They'd lost 2 horses to the cold and 1 man to what Torvin called environmental attrition, which was a polite way of saying his heart had just stopped beating somewhere between one step and the next. They'd buried him in a shallow grave marked with stones, because that's all you could do in frozen ground. Your Grace, Torvin called from the front of the column. There's a valley ahead, might have shelter. Cassian urged his horse forward until he was riding beside his captain. The valley spread out below them, a natural depression carved between 2 mountain ridges. At the bottom, barely visible through the failing light, was a cluster of structures that might have been a settlement once. Looks abandoned, Torvin said. Everything out here is abandoned. The question is whether it's structurally sound enough to keep us alive through the night. Only one way to find out. They descended into the valley as the sun dropped behind the western peaks, turning the sky the color of old blood. The settlement was worse up close than it had looked from above. Most of the buildings had collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and time, but there was one structure, larger than the rest, that still had a roof and 4 walls. It had been a mining headquarters, back when the northern veins still produced silver worth dying for. Now it was just another corpse of imperial ambition, slowly being consumed by the wilderness. Cassian's men moved through the building with military efficiency, checking for structural weaknesses, setting up defensive positions, starting fires in hearths that hadn't seen flame in probably 20 years. The smoke that rose from the chimneys was gray and thick, the kind that would be visible for miles if anyone was looking. Cassian didn't care. Let them come. He was done running. Isolda dismounted stiffly, her movements careful in a way that made his chest tighten. He wanted to help her, but understood that his hands were stained with fresh kills, and offering comfort with blood still under your fingernails sent mixed messages. She walked into the building without looking at him, and that hurt more than any of the wounds he'd taken in the outpost. Torvin appeared at his shoulder. We need to talk about what happens next. What happens next is we survive the night, and after that we keep surviving. That's not a strategy, Your Grace. That's just postponing the inevitable. Cassian turned to face his oldest friend. The firelight from inside the building cast shadows across Torvin's scarred face, making him look older than his 43 years. You think I don't know that? Cassian said quietly. You think I don't understand what I've done? I've broken my oath to the crown. I've killed men sent by the Grand Chancellor. I've abandoned a political alliance that took 5 years to build. The second we rode out of Blackmore, I became a traitor. Then why did you do it? Because the alternative was watching her disappear into wilderness alone and pregnant, while I played house with Celine Varick and pretended I was anything other than a coward. So what now? We hide in the mountains until the Grand Chancellor's reach extends this far north? Because it will, eventually. The Crown doesn't forget insults, and you just committed the kind of insult they write cautionary tales about. Cassian looked up at the mountains that surrounded them, dark shapes against a darker sky. Then we make sure the cautionary tale ends differently than they expect. How? I don't know yet, but I've got time to figure it out. Torvin was quiet for a moment. Then he clapped Cassian on the shoulder with enough force to remind him that the wound from the assassin's blade was still fresh. For what it's worth, he said, I think you made the right choice. Terrible choice. Career-ending choice. Probably kingdom-fracturing choice, but right nonetheless. That's not worth much. It's worth what it's worth. Torvin walked away to organize the night watch, leaving Cassian standing in the cold dark, wondering when the right choice had started feeling so much like the wrong one. Yeah. He found Isolda in what used to be the mining administrator's office. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, staring at nothing. The firelight caught in her eyes, turning them copper instead of their usual winter steel. She'd removed the outer layers of fur and looked smaller without them, more vulnerable. Cassian sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind made sounds like a dying animal. Finally, Isolda broke the silence. How many men did you lose today? 1 to the cold, 4 wounded, 2 seriously. Because of me. Because of choices I made. Don't take credit for my decisions. Your decisions to chase after me. Your decisions to fight assassins sent to kill me. Your decisions to throw away everything you've built for the last decade. Yes. She turned to look at him, and he saw something in her expression that he'd never seen before. Not fear, exactly. Something worse. Guilt. I was trying to make it easier for you, she said. I thought if I just disappeared, you could tell yourself I'd made the choice. That you'd tried to find me, but I'd covered my tracks too well. You could marry Celine with a clear conscience and secure the treaty and continue ruling the North like you were meant to. And you'd what? Raise our child alone in some forgotten township, pretending you were a widow? It's been done before. Not by you. She laughed bitterly. You don't know what I'm capable of. Yes, I do. That's why I came after you. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled too tight. Cassian reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, the knuckles rough from 3 days of hard riding. He pressed his thumb against her pulse point and felt her heartbeat, steady and strong. I need you to understand something, he said. When I rode out of Blackmore, I wasn't trying to save you. I was trying to save myself. She looked at him sharply. What does that mean? It means I've spent my entire life making calculated decisions based on strategy and survival. Every alliance I've formed, every battle I've fought, every choice I've made has been filtered through the question of what serves the greater good, what strengthens the North, what maintains stability. And you know what I realized when you left? What? That stability built on lies isn't stability at all. It's just a prettier version of collapse. Isolda's eyes filled with tears. Don't do that. Don't make this about philosophy or higher truth. You destroyed your political future for me. That's not noble. That's not strategic. That's just stupid. Maybe. But it's my stupid to own. The tears spilled over, running down her cheeks in tracks that caught the firelight. She pulled her hand away from his and covered her face. I'm so tired, she whispered. I'm so tired of being the variable that ruins everything. Cassian reached for her again, this time pulling her against his chest. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed into him like something breaking. You haven't ruined anything, he said into her hair. You've just revealed what was already broken. She cried silently, her body shaking with the effort of keeping the sound contained. Cassian held her and stared at the shadows dancing on the wall, wondering how many more people were going to die because he'd chosen love over duty. The answer, he suspected, was more than he wanted to count. Okay. The attack came 3 hours before dawn. Cassian woke to the sound of Kael's warning whistle, a high, sharp note that cut through the darkness like a blade. He was on his feet before conscious thought caught up with instinct, sword in hand, body already moving toward the defensive positions. How many? He called to Torvin, who was crouched by the eastern window. At least 20, maybe more. They're surrounding the building. Cassian did the math in his head. He had 8 men, 2 seriously wounded. Against 20 trained soldiers, the numbers didn't work in his favor. But numbers had never been his advantage anyway. Wake everyone, he ordered. Full combat gear. We hold this position until dawn, then we break out through the western approach. And if they have the western approach covered, then we make our own exit. He moved through the building, checking positions, reinforcing weak points, doing all the small things that separated soldiers who survived from soldiers who became statistics. His men moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd been in bad situations before and understood that panic was more dangerous than enemy blades. Isolda appeared from the back room, pale but composed. She'd found a knife somewhere, a short, ugly thing designed for close work. You need to stay at the interior room, Cassian told her. I need to be able to defend myself if your line breaks. The line won't break. Everything breaks eventually. He wanted to argue, but she was right, and they both knew it. Instead, he gripped her shoulder once, hard enough to bruise. Stay alive, he said. That's the plan. Then she was gone, disappearing back into the relative safety of the administrator's office, and Cassian was left standing in the main hall with the weight of command settling over him like familiar armor. The first volley of arrows came through the windows, black shafts whistling in the darkness. His men ducked behind cover, but not fast enough. Garrett Stone took an arrow through the shoulder and went down cursing. Another man, a young soldier named Finn, who joined the regiment 6 months ago, caught one in the thigh. Cassian moved to the nearest window and looked out at the surrounding darkness. He could see shapes moving in the pre-dawn gloom, figures that stayed just outside the firelight's reach. They were being methodical, professional. This wasn't some hastily assembled hit squad. These were soldiers who'd done siege work before. That made them dangerous, but it also made them predictable. Torvin, Cassian called across the room, how much oil do we have left? 2 barrels, maybe 3. Bring them to the front windows. You're going to burn them out? I'm going to make them choose between pressing the attack and not dying screaming. It wasn't elegant, but warfare rarely was. They hauled the oil barrels to the windows and prepared torches from broken furniture and rags soaked in rendering fat. The smell was thick and choking, the kind of odor that stuck in your throat and made breathing an active decision. On my mark, Cassian said, torch in one hand, sword in the other. The attackers chose that moment to rush the building. They came from 3 sides simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers. Cassian could see them now in the growing light, men in unmarked armor carrying weapons that were too expensive to belong to common mercenaries. Crowned soldiers, he realized, not the Chancellor's private thugs, but actual military from the southern garrisons. That changed things. That changed everything. Now, he shouted. They hurled the oil through the windows first, the barrels breaking open and spreading their contents across the frozen ground. Then came the torches, arcing through the air like falling stars. The world outside turned to fire. Men screamed as flames caught on oil-soaked armor and clothing. The organized assault broke apart into chaos as soldiers tried to extinguish themselves or flee beyond the fire's reach. The smell of burning flesh mixed with burning oil, creating a stench that would have made Cassian vomit if he hadn't smelled it before in the border campaigns. But the fire only stopped them for a moment. Professional soldiers didn't break just because things got difficult. They adapted. The Crown's men regrouped beyond the flames and came at the building from a different angle, using the smoke as cover. They hit the eastern wall with what sounded like a battering ram, the impact shaking the entire structure. Once, twice. On the third hit, the wall cracked, ancient timber giving way to modern force. Cassian grabbed the nearest men and formed a defensive line facing the breach. When the wall finally collapsed, he was ready. The first soldier through the gap died on Cassian's blade before he understood what was happening. The second managed to get his sword up in time to parry, but Cassian was already inside his guard, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and sending him backward into his companions. The fighting became vicious and close, the kind where you could smell your opponent's fear and feel their blood spray across your face. Cassian fought with the cold precision that had made him legendary, each movement economical and brutal. But there were too many of them. For every soldier he cut down, 2 more came through the breach. His men were being pushed back, the defensive line compressing toward the center of the building. Garrett, fighting one-handed with an arrow still in his shoulder, went down under 2 attackers. Kale took a sword thrust through the ribs and dropped without a sound. Cassian felt the battle turning, felt victory slipping through his fingers like water. He'd been in situations like this before, where the only question was whether you died standing or running. He'd always chosen standing. Then he heard Isolda scream. The sound cut through the chaos like a knife through fabric. Cassian turned and saw 2 soldiers forcing their way into the back room where he'd told her to hide. He didn't think. He just moved. He crossed the distance between them in seconds that felt like hours, his sword becoming an extension of rage rather than strategy. The first soldier turned just in time to die surprised. The second managed to draw his weapon, but not to use it before Cassian's blade took him across the throat. Isolda stood pressed against the far wall, the knife she'd found held in both hands like she was praying to it. Her eyes were wide and bright with something that looked like terror, but might have been fury. "Are you hurt?" Cassian demanded. "No. Can you run?" "Yes." "Then we're leaving. Now." He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the back of the building, where a narrow door led out into what used to be a storage yard. Behind them, the sounds of fighting continued, metal on metal, screaming, the wet sounds of bodies giving up. Torvin appeared from the smoke, blood running down his face, from a cut above his eye. "The eastern wall is collapsed. We've lost 4 men. The rest are falling back." How many attackers left? Too many. Cassian made the calculation in his head. They couldn't win this fight. Staying meant dying, and dying meant Isolda died too, and the child she carried, and everything he'd sacrificed became meaningless. "Sound the retreat," he said. "Everyone out through the western approach. We regroup in the hills." "Your Grace?" "That's an order." Torvin nodded once and disappeared back into the smoke. Moments later, a horn sounded 3 short blasts, the signal they'd agreed on for tactical withdrawal, which was military language for running away but with dignity. Cassian led Isolda out into the pre-dawn darkness. Behind them, the building was coming apart under the assault, timber cracking and stone crumbling. His remaining men streamed out of various exits, some supporting wounded companions, all of them moving with the desperate speed of people who understood that stopping meant death. They ran. Through the settlement ruins, across open ground that left them exposed to arrows, up the slopes of the valley where the terrain turned steep and treacherous. Cassian kept Isolda's hand locked in his, pulling her forward when she stumbled, practically carrying her over rough patches. Behind them, the crowned soldiers gave chase, but they were wearing full armor, and the northern terrain wasn't kind to heavy infantry. The gap widened, not much, but enough. They reached a ridgeline just as the sun broke over the eastern mountains, turning the sky from black to gray to pale gold. Cassian looked back at the valley below. The mining settlement was burning now, smoke rising in thick columns. He counted his men. 6 left, including Torvin. Out of the 10 he'd started with, 4 dead in 3 days. The cost kept climbing. Isolda collapsed beside him, gasping for air, her face the color of old parchment. He wanted to give her time to recover, but time was a luxury they didn't have. "We need to keep moving," he said gently. "They'll reorganize and come after us." She nodded, still too breathless to speak. Torvin limped over, favoring his left leg where an enemy blade had found the gap in his armor. That was a Crown assault force, 25 men, maybe 30. That's not the Chancellor's private thugs. That's official sanction. Cassian felt something cold settle in his stomach. Meaning? Meaning the king has declared you an active rebellion. This isn't political maneuvering anymore. This is war. The words hung in the thin mountain air like smoke. Cassian looked down at Isolda, who had pulled herself into a sitting position and was staring at the burning valley below. Her expression was blank, neutral, giving away nothing. But he could see her hands shaking. He'd done this to her, pulled her into a conflict that was bigger than both of them, turned her into a symbol of his defiance, whether she wanted to be or not. The Iron Duke had chosen his path. Now they all had to walk it. They spent 3 days moving through terrain that seemed designed specifically to kill travelers. The mountains grew steeper, the valleys deeper. The temperature dropped until breathing became painful and exposed skin went numb in minutes. They lost 2 more men, one to a fall during a night crossing and another who simply stopped moving and never started again. By the time they reached the northern mining settlements, Cassian's regiment had been reduced to himself, Torvin, and 3 soldiers who looked more like ghosts than men. The settlement was called Varna's Rest, a cluster of buildings clinging to the side of a mountain like barnacles on a ship's hull. It had been a silver mining town once, back when the veins still ran rich. Now it was the kind of place people came to when they'd run out of everywhere else to go. The settlement elder was a woman named Kara, who looked like she'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains. She took one look at Cassian's group and knew exactly what they were. "Running from the crown," she said. It wasn't a question. "Running from a lot of things," Cassian replied. "This is neutral territory. We don't pick sides." "I'm not asking you to pick sides. I'm asking for shelter and supplies. I can pay." "Crown coin spends the same as rebel coin," Kara said, which was the closest thing to acceptance he was going to get. She led them to a building on the edge of the settlement, a long, low structure that had been a barracks for miners before the veins ran dry. It was drafty and cold, but it had a roof and walls and the relative promise that they wouldn't freeze to death overnight. Isolda collapsed onto one of the beds without bothering to remove her outer layers. She'd barely spoken since the attack on the mining headquarters, had moved through the last 3 days with mechanical efficiency, eating when told to eat, sleeping when there was opportunity, never complaining. But Cassian could see the toll it was taking. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Dark circles ringed her eyes. Her movements had become careful, protective, the way pregnant women moved when they were afraid of damaging what they carried. He sat down beside her, and she turned to look at him with eyes that seemed older than they had a week ago. "How much longer?" she asked. "Until what?" "Until we stop running." "I don't know. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." She sat up slowly, wincing as muscles that had been pushed too hard protested. "We can't keep doing this. Running from settlement to settlement, barely staying ahead of whoever the crown sends next. Eventually they'll corner us, and then what? You'll fight another hopeless battle and lose more men who followed you out of loyalty rather than good sense? So what do you suggest?" "I suggest you stop thinking like a soldier and start thinking like a politician." Cassian felt anger flare in his chest. "I tried being a politician. That's what got us into this situation in the first place." "No," she said sharply. "What got us into this situation was the Grand Chancellor's ambition and the Crown's need to control the North through marriage alliances. The political system created this trap. We just happened to be the ones who refused to pretend it wasn't a trap." He stared at her, processing. "So what's your solution?" "Find leverage. The same way you always have. The Chancellor isn't invulnerable. Neither is the King. Powerful men always have weaknesses. You just need to find them and exploit them. From here, we don't have access to intelligence networks or court informants. We're in the middle of nowhere with 4 exhausted soldiers and diminishing resources. Then we find different resources." Isolda stood up and walked to the narrow window that looked out over the settlement. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. "When I was running from Blackmore," she said quietly, "I wasn't just running blind. I had a destination in mind." "Where?" "There's a woman in the eastern provinces, Lady Meera Torvin. She runs a network of informants and smugglers, the kind of operation that exists in the spaces between official authority. She and I have corresponded for years, sharing information about trade routes and political movements. Why haven't you mentioned this before?" "Because I wasn't sure you'd be willing to ask for help. The Iron Duke doesn't beg." "I'm not begging. I'm negotiating." "Then negotiate. Lady Meera has resources we need. Intelligence about the Chancellor's movements, connections to dissidents in the southern provinces, access to people who might be willing to support a northern rebellion if they thought it served their interests. And what does she want in return? I don't know yet. But everything has a price. We just need to decide if we're willing to pay it." Cassian considered this. The idea of owing favors to a woman who ran an information network from the shadows didn't appeal to him, but appealing options had run out somewhere around the time he'd killed the Grand Chancellor's assassins. How do we reach her? Isolda turned away from the window. We send a message. Coded. Through channels she'll recognize as coming from me. How long until she responds? If she responds? Days, maybe weeks. If she decides we're more trouble than we're worth, maybe never. That's not much of a plan. It's better than what we have now, which is nothing. She was right, and they both knew it. Cassian stood and walked over to her, close enough to see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the way her jaw was set with stubborn determination. You're stronger than I gave you credit for, he said. I'm not strong, I'm just too tired to be weak. He reached out and pulled her against him, careful of her condition, mindful of her fragility. She leaned into him, and for a moment they just stood there in the failing light, two people who'd chosen each other over empires and were learning what that choice actually cost. We're going to survive this, he said into her hair. Promise? No, but I'll die trying. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. It's just true. Outside, the sun finished setting, and the northern wilderness settled into the kind of darkness that was absolute and unforgiving. In the distance, somewhere beyond the mountains, the Crown's forces were regrouping and planning their next move. And in a barracks at the edge of the world, two people who'd destroyed everything for each other held on and wondered if love was supposed to feel this much like warfare. The message went out the next morning through a courier Kara reluctantly provided. Cassian spent the following days in a kind of purgatory, waiting for a response that might never come while watching Isolda grow more fragile. She tried to hide it, maintaining the same steel-eyed composure that had first attracted him. But he could see the cracks forming. She slept more, ate less, spent long hours staring at nothing with an expression that suggested she was calculating odds she didn't like. On the fifth day, Torvin found him in the makeshift war room he'd set up in Kara's administrative building. We have a problem, Torvin said, which had become his standard greeting. Add it to the list. This one's different. There are rumors coming up from the southern settlements. The Crown has put a price on your head. 10,000 gold crowns for you alive, 5,000 for you dead. Cassian felt something cold settle in his chest. And Isolda? 2,000, dead or alive. The casual way they'd commodified her life made his hands curl into fists. Who's spreading the bounty? Crown heralds. They're posting notices in every settlement between here and the capital. You're officially a traitor to the realm. She's officially your accomplice. How long before bounty hunters start showing up? They're probably already on the way. Cassian stood and walked to the map of the northern territories that Kara had provided. He traced the routes from the southern provinces with his finger, calculating travel times and approach vectors. We need to fortify this position, he said. Set up early warning systems on all the approach roads. Anyone coming into Varna's Rest gets identified before they reach the settlement. And if they're just merchants or travelers, then we let them pass. But we watch them. Torvin nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. There's something else. Of course there is. Lady Isolda asked me about escape routes. Wanted to know if there were paths out of here that you wouldn't know about. Cassian's blood went cold. When was this? This morning. Did you tell her? Hell, I told her there were no routes out of here that didn't go through terrain that would kill her in her condition. She didn't seem satisfied with that answer. Cassian didn't wait for more details. He strode out of the administrative building and across the settlement to the barracks where Isolda was supposed to be resting. She wasn't there. He found her 20 minutes later at the northern edge of the settlement, standing at the trailhead that led deeper into the mountains. She had a pack slung over her shoulder and was studying a hand-drawn map. Going somewhere? Cassian asked from behind her. She didn't turn around, just kept staring at the map like it held answers. I'm thinking about it, she said, without telling me. Would you have tried to stop me? Yes. That's why I didn't tell you. He walked around to face her, forcing her to meet his eyes. What happened to finding leverage and negotiating with Lady Meera? That was before the bounty. Before I realized that every moment I stay with you increases the chance that you'll die protecting me. So your solution is to walk off into the wilderness alone and pregnant and hope for the best? My solution is to remove the target from your back. That's not how this works. Then explain to me how it does work. Because from where I'm standing, you've lost half your men protecting someone who's only valuable to you because of a moment of weakness we both had 2 years ago. The words hit him like physical blows, each one precisely aimed for maximum damage. "Is that what you think this is?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A moment of weakness? What else would you call it?" He grabbed her shoulders, not roughly but firmly enough that she couldn't look away. "I would call it the only honest decision I've made in my entire adult life. I would call it choosing something real over something politically expedient. I would call it a lot of things, but weakness isn't one of them." "Then you're lying to yourself," she said, and there were tears on her face now. "Because strong men don't abandon kingdoms for women they barely know. Strong men don't throw away decades of careful political work because they can't control their desires. Strong men make the hard choices that keep everyone else alive." "You're right," he said. "Strong men make hard choices. So here's mine. You're not leaving, not now, not ever. I don't care if you hate me for it. I don't care if you think I'm being irrational. You're staying where I can protect you, and that's final. You can't just order me around like one of your soldiers. Watch me." They stared at each other, and the air between them crackled with something that was part anger and part something else entirely. Finally, Isolda looked away. "I'm trying to save you," she whispered. "I don't want to be saved. I want you alive, even if it costs you everything?" Especially then. She sagged against him, the fight going out of her all at once. He wrapped his arms around her and held on while she cried into his chest, her body shaking with sobs that sounded like they were being torn out of her. And standing there at the edge of the northern wilderness, with a price on both their heads and enemies closing in from all sides, Cassian understood that this was the point of no return. There was no going back to Blackmore, no reconciling with the crown, no political solution that ended with both of them alive and free. The only way forward was through blood and fire, and the kind of choices that would haunt him for whatever time he had left. But at least he wouldn't die wondering what could have been. At least he'd die knowing he'd chosen truth over comfort. And in a world built on lies and compromise and the slow erosion of everything that mattered, maybe that was enough. The response from Lady Meera arrived on the 8th day, delivered by a courier who looked like he'd been assembled from scar tissue and bad decisions. His name was Corvus, and he carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd survived situations that should have killed him. He handed Cassian a sealed letter without ceremony, then stood waiting with the patience of someone who got paid by the hour. Cassian broke the seal and read. The letter was written in code, but it was a simple substitution cipher that Isolda had apparently taught Lady Meera years ago. It took him 10 minutes to decode, on Pishmans, and what he read made his blood run cold. Duke Vale, your situation is known to me through mutual connections. I'm willing to provide sanctuary and resources in exchange for information about northern military deployments and trade routes. Meet me at the Crossroads Inn 3 days hence. Come alone or bring your woman, but no soldiers. This offer expires with the deadline. Choose wisely. Meera. Cassian read it twice more, analyzing every word for hidden meaning or threat. The phrasing was clinical, transactional. This wasn't an ally offering help. This was a merchant calculating profit margins. But it was also the only option that didn't end with him and Isolda freezing to death in the mountains or getting run down by crown soldiers. He looked up at Corvus. You're supposed to wait for a response? I'm supposed to confirm you received the message and report whether you look desperate enough to accept. And what's your assessment? You look like a man who's run out of good choices and is eyeing the bad ones. Accurate. Cassian walked to the window and stared out at Varna's Rest. The settlement had the permanent look of something slowly dying, buildings in various states of collapse, people moving through their routines with the mechanical efficiency of the defeated. Tell Lady Meera I accept her terms, he said. 3 days. The Crossroads Inn. Just you? Me and Lady Isolda. Corvus nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. Word of advice, Your Grace. Lady Meera doesn't do charity. Whatever she's offering, the price is going to be higher than you think. Make sure you can afford it before you start negotiating. Then he was gone, disappearing into the settlement like smoke dispersing. Cassian stood alone in the room, holding a letter that felt like it weighed more than it should, and wondered when exactly he'd lost control of his own life. Isolda took the news better than he expected. They were in the barracks, the space lit by a single candle that cast more shadows than light. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap with careful precision, listening as he explained Lady Meera's offer. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She wants intelligence about the North, Isolda said finally. That means she's either working for the crown or planning to sell the information to them. Or she's building her own power base and wants leverage against both sides, which makes her dangerous in a different way. Everything is dangerous now. At least this danger comes with a path forward. Isolde stood and walked to the small mirror hanging on the wall. She studied her reflection with the detached interest of someone examining a stranger. Her face had grown thinner over the past 2 weeks, the bones more prominent. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her skin had taken on a translucent quality that made her look fragile. I don't trust her, Isolde said to her reflection. I don't either. But trust isn't a luxury we can afford. Then what are we affording? Survival. One day at a time. She turned away from the mirror and met his eyes. And when we run out of days, then we deal with that when it happens. That's not a plan. It's the only one we have. The candle flickered, throwing their shadows against the wall in distorted shapes. Outside, the wind made sounds like something hunting. Cassian crossed the room and took her hands. They were cold, the fingers delicate but strong. He pressed his thumbs against her pulse points and felt her heartbeat, fast and light. I know you're scared, he said quietly. I know this isn't the life you signed up for when you came to Blackmore, but I need you to hold on a little longer. How much longer? Until I can make this right. And if you can't, then we go down fighting, and at least we go down together. She pulled her hands away, not roughly, but with finality. You keep saying things like that. Going down together, dying together. Like it's romantic instead of just wasteful. The words stung because they were true. What do you want me to say? He asked. I want you to say that you have an actual plan beyond just reacting to whatever crisis comes next. I want you to say that you've thought about what happens if Lady Meera betrays us, or if the crown finds us before we reach the Crossroads Inn, or if I go into labor in the middle of nowhere with no physician and no help. He stared at her, processing the fear beneath the anger. You think I haven't thought about those things? He said, his voice harder than he intended. You think I'm not running every scenario through my head at night while you're sleeping? I know the odds. I know how many ways this can go wrong, but sitting here paralyzed by possibilities doesn't change anything. Then what does? Moving forward, making decisions. Accepting that every choice might be the wrong one, but making it anyway because the alternative is surrendering. She laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. You really believe that? That moving forward is always better than stopping to think? I believe that thinking without acting is just another form of dying. They stared at each other across the small room, and the distance between them felt wider than it had any right to be. Finally, Isolde looked away. When do we leave? Tomorrow at dawn. We'll travel light and fast. 2 days to reach the Crossroads Inn, 1 day margin for complications. And Torvin stays here with the remaining men. If this is a trap, I don't want to walk everyone into it. You mean if this is a trap, you only want to sacrifice yourself and me? Yes. At least you're honest about it. She turned and walked toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. For what it's worth, I don't think you're wrong. I think you're doing the best you can with impossible circumstances. I just wish the best you can do felt less like slow-motion suicide. Then she was gone, leaving him alone with the candle and his thoughts, and the growing certainty that he was leading them both towards something he couldn't see coming. They left Varna's Rest before sunrise, riding horses that Kara had reluctantly provided in exchange for most of Cassian's remaining gold. Torvin stood at the settlement edge, watching them prepare to leave with an expression that said he knew this was a mistake, but respected Cassian's right to make it anyway. If you're not back in 5 days, Torvin said, I'm coming after you. If we're not back in 5 days, we're probably dead. Don't waste more lives on corpses. That's not your decision to make. Actually, it is. I'm still giving orders, last I checked. Torvin smiled grimly. For now. They clasped forearms, the gesture carrying all the weight of shared history and unspoken loyalty. Then Cassian mounted his horse and rode out into the pre-dawn darkness with Isolde beside him, leaving behind the last fragment of his army and whatever safety Varna's Rest had provided. The journey to the Crossroads Inn took them through territory that felt actively hostile to human presence. The mountains were sharp and unforgiving, the valleys deep enough that sunlight only reached them for a few hours each day. They passed abandoned mining camps and forgotten settlements, places where people had tried to carve out existence and failed. Isolde rode in silence most of the first day, wrapped in furs that made her look smaller than she was. Cassian watched her from the corner of his eye, noting the careful way she sat in the saddle, the protective curve of her spine. "How are you feeling?" he asked during a brief rest stop. "Like I'm being used as a bargaining chip in a game I don't understand. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" "It's survival." She laughed bitterly. "Everything is survival with you. But at some point, survival stops being a strategy and becomes just prolonging the inevitable. You want me to give up? Surrender to the crown and hope they're merciful? I want you to admit that we're not going to win this. That the best we can hope for is to escape with our lives and disappear somewhere the crown can't reach. There is nowhere the crown can't reach. You know that. Then what are we doing?" He didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound like a lie, so he said nothing. They rode on through landscape that grew progressively more barren, until even the scrub vegetation gave up and left only stone and ice. On the second day, they spotted riders in the distance, dark shapes moving parallel to their path. "We're being followed," Cassian said quietly. Isolda looked back over her shoulder. "How many? 3? Maybe 4. Staying just outside arrow range. Bounty hunters? Probably. Or crown scouts. Either way, it's not good." They pushed the horses harder, but the riders kept pace, maintaining the same distance like wolves following wounded prey. As the sun began to set, Cassian made a decision he knew was risky, but couldn't avoid. "We're not stopping for the night," he said. "We ride through darkness. The horses won't make it. They'll make it, or they won't. But if we stop, those riders will close the gap, and I'd rather face them on horseback than on foot." Isolda nodded, her face pale but determined. They rode through night that was absolute and disorienting, trusting the horses to navigate terrain they couldn't see. The followers stayed with them, visible as darker shadows against dark landscape. Cassian's hand never left his sword hilt. Dawn found them approaching a valley where smoke rose from multiple chimneys, marking civilization of some kind. As they descended, Cassian could make out buildings clustered around a central structure that had to be the Crossroads Inn. It was larger than he'd expected, a 3-story building that looked like it had been constructed from pieces of other structures. Architectural styles clashed in ways that suggested decades of additions and modifications. The courtyard was busy with travelers and merchants, the kind of neutral ground where questions weren't asked and everyone minded their own business. Cassian and Isolda rode into the courtyard just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. The followers who'd tracked them through the night melted away into the crowd, still watching but no longer openly pursuing. They dismounted stiffly, bodies protesting after 30 hours in the saddle. A stable boy approached to take their horses, and Cassian handed over the reins along with a coin. Inside, the inn was warm and crowded, the air thick with smoke and the smell of food and unwashed bodies. A woman stood behind the bar, tall and elegant in a way that seemed out of place in this rough establishment. Her hair was silver white, pulled back in a severe style, and her eyes were the color of winter ice. She looked at Cassian and smiled. "Duke Vale," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You're right on time. I appreciate punctuality." "Lady Meera, I presume." "The same. Please join me upstairs where we can speak privately." She led them through the crowd and up a narrow staircase to a room on the 3rd floor. It was furnished simply but comfortably, with a table set for 3 and a fire burning in the hearth. Meera gestured for them to sit. Food and wine appeared, brought by servants who moved with silent efficiency. Cassian waited until they were alone before speaking. "You said you could help us. I said I would provide sanctuary and resources in exchange for information. Help is a different transaction entirely. Then let's talk about the exchange." Meera poured wine into 3 glasses with careful precision. "I want detailed intelligence about northern military deployments, specifically the garrison strength at Blackmore and the border fortifications along the Kethrin Pass. I want trade route information, including seasonal variations and security protocols. And I want your assessment of which northern lords might be convinced to shift their loyalty away from the crown." "That's treason," Isolda said quietly. Meera smiled. "Only if you're caught, and only if the crown survives long enough to prosecute." Cassian studied the woman across from him. She was older than he'd expected, probably in her 50s, with the kind of face that gave away nothing. But her eyes were sharp and calculating, the eyes of someone who played long games. "What are you planning?" he asked. "I'm planning to be on the winning side of whatever conflict emerges from this mess. The North is fracturing, the Grand Chancellor is overreaching, the King is weak. These are conditions that create opportunity for those wise enough to see it. And you think giving you intelligence about my forces creates opportunity? I think it creates leverage. And leverage is the only currency that matters when empires start to crumble. Cassian felt something cold settle in his chest. You're not offering sanctuary. You're recruiting assets. I'm offering what you need in exchange for what I need. That's how negotiations work. And if I refuse, then you walk out of here with no resources, no allies, and bounty hunters tracking your every move. How long do you think you'll last? He wanted to stand up and walk out, wanted to tell this woman to take her offer and burn it. But he could feel Isolda beside him, exhausted and pregnant and running out of reserves, and pride felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. I'll give you the information, he said slowly, but I want more than sanctuary in return. Name your price. I want safe passage to the eastern provinces. I want enough gold to disappear and live comfortably for at least 5 years. And I want your assurance that neither the crown nor the chancellor will be able to track us. Meera considered this. That's expensive. So is treason. She laughed, actually laughed, and it sounded genuine. I like you, Duke Vale. You negotiate like a man who understands that everything has a price and nothing is given freely. I learned from experience. Then we have a deal. Provide the intelligence I've requested, and I'll ensure you and your lady disappear so thoroughly that even the crown's best hunters won't find you. She extended her hand across the table. Cassian looked at it for a long moment, knowing that shaking it would be crossing another line, another point of no return. He shook it. Meera smiled. Excellent. I'll have documents prepared for you to review and annotate. Should take a few hours. In the meantime, please rest. You both look like you need it. She stood and walked to the door, then paused. Oh, and Duke Vale, the men who followed you here? They work for me. I needed to make sure you were alone and desperate enough to accept my terms. No hard feelings. Then she was gone, leaving Cassian sitting at the table with the taste of ash in his mouth and the knowledge that he'd just sold out everything he'd spent his life building. Isolde reached across and took his hand. You did what you had to do. Did I? Yes. Then why does it feel like I just handed her a knife and pointed out where to stick it? Because that's exactly what you did. But the alternative was worse. He pulled his hand away and stood, walking to the window. Below, the courtyard was still busy with travelers coming and going. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that the man standing above them had just committed treason for the price of survival. We should rest, Isolda said from behind him. You haven't slept in 2 days. I'm not tired. That's a lie. Probably. She came to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth. When this is over, when we've disappeared and settled somewhere safe, are you going to be able to live with what you've done? The question hung in the air between them. I don't know, he said finally. Ask me when we get there. Seg. The knock on the door came 3 hours later. Cassian woke from a sleep he hadn't meant to fall into, his hand already reaching for his sword. But it was just one of Meera's servants, a young woman who handed him a sealed envelope and left without speaking. Inside was a list of questions, detailed and specific. Garrison numbers, supply chain routes, defensive vulnerabilities, officer names and loyalties. The kind of information that could dismantle the northern defenses in a matter of weeks if it fell into the wrong hands. Cassian stared at the questions and felt something break inside him. This wasn't just intelligence gathering. This was a blueprint for conquest. He was about to destroy everything his family had built for 6 generations, and he was doing it for a woman who might not even want him once she understood the full cost of his choice. He began to write. The words came slowly at first, each sentence feeling like a small death. But then momentum took over, and the information poured out of him with mechanical precision. Troop movements, weak points in the border fortifications, which lords could be bribed, and which would fight to the death. He wrote for hours, filling page after page with betrayal dressed up as survival. When he finally finished, the sun was setting again, painting the room in shades of copper and blood. His hand cramped from holding the pen, and his eyes burned from strain. Isolda had watched him work in silence, her expression unreadable. It's done, he said, setting down the pen. She picked up the pages and read through them slowly. When she looked up, there were tears on her face. This will get people killed, she said. Good people, people who trusted you. I know. And you wrote it anyway. I wrote it because the alternative was watching you die. If that makes me a monster, then I'm a monster. I can live with that. Can you? The question hit him harder than any physical blow could have. He stood and walked to the door, pages in hand. I'll deliver this to Meera. Then we wait for her to arrange our passage east. Cassian, don't. Whatever you're about to say, just don't. I know what I've done. I know what it costs. I don't need you to forgive me or understand me or even stay with me once we're safe. I just need you to survive. He left before she could respond, walking down the narrow hallway to Meera's room with pages that felt like they weighed as much as kingdoms. Meera was waiting, sitting by the fire with a glass of wine. She took the papers without ceremony and began reading, her expression neutral. After several minutes, she looked up and smiled. This is excellent work, Duke Vale. Thorough, detailed, exactly what I needed. When do we leave? Tomorrow at dawn. I have a wagon prepared and documents that will get you through Crown checkpoints. You'll travel as merchants fleeing northern instability. Boring and unremarkable. And the gold? Already loaded in the wagon. 50,000 crowns. Enough to live comfortably for a decade if you're smart about it. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt like escape and relief and the promise of a future. Instead, it felt like drowning in shallow water, knowing that standing up would save you, but being too tired to try. Cassian turned to leave, but Meera's voice stopped him. One more thing, she said. The information you've provided is valuable, but not quite valuable enough to justify the risk I'm taking by helping you. He turned back slowly. What do you mean? I need one more piece of intelligence. Something that makes this entire transaction worthwhile for me. We had a deal, and I'm adjusting the terms. That's how business works when one party has all the leverage. What do you want? I want you to tell me where Torvin Blackwood is currently stationed and how many men he commands. Cassian felt ice spread through his veins. Why? Because Torvin is the real military mind behind the northern defenses. You're the political figure, but he's the tactical genius. With him gone, the North becomes vulnerable in ways that pure intelligence can't achieve. You want me to give you his location so you can have him killed. I want you to provide information. What happens with that information is not your concern. He's my oldest friend. Then this should be an easy decision. Your oldest friend or the woman carrying your child. Choose. The room went silent except for the crackle of the fire. Cassian understood in that moment that Meera had never intended to honor their agreement. This had always been a trap, layers of manipulation designed to extract maximum value before disposing of the asset, and he'd walked right into it. I won't do it, he said. Meera sighed. Then our deal is void. You can walk out of here empty-handed, or I can have my men detain you and deliver you to the crown for the bounty. Either way, you lose. You'd betray me after I gave you everything you asked for? I'd do what serves my interests. You should appreciate that. It's the same calculation you made when you abandoned your duties to chase after Lady Isolda. The words were designed to cut, and they did. Cassian's hand moved to his sword hilt, but there were armed men stationed outside the door. He could hear them shifting position, ready to respond to any threat. How long do I have to decide? He asked. Until dawn. After that, the offer expires, and you become a liability I can't afford. She turned back to the fire, dismissing him. Cassian walked back to his room in a daze, his mind racing through scenarios that all ended in blood and failure. When he opened the door, Isolda took one look at his face and understood immediately. What happened? She wants Torvin, his location, his troop strength, in exchange for completing our deal. Isolda went pale. You can't give her that. I know. Then what are we going to do? He sat down heavily on the bed and put his head in his hands. I don't know. If I refuse, she'll either kill us or hand us over to the crown. If I comply, I send my oldest friend to his death. There's no good choice. Then we run. Right now. We take the horses and disappear before she can stop us. With what resources? We have no gold, no supplies, and we're surrounded by our people. We wouldn't make it out of the courtyard, so we're trapped. Yes. They sat in silence as the implications settled over them like falling snow. Finally, Isolda spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What if there was another option? What option? What if we gave her false information? Sent her people to the wrong location, gave her time to think she'd won while we escape. She'll verify the intelligence before acting on it, and when she discovers the deception, she'll hunt us to the ends of the earth. Then we make sure the deception is believable enough that she doesn't verify until it's too late. Cassian looked at her, seeing the desperate intelligence working behind her eyes. It was a terrible plan. It was also the only plan they had. "I'll need to make it convincing," he said. "Detailed enough that she believes it, but wrong enough that Torvin has time to relocate before her people arrive. Can you do that?" "I don't know, but I'm going to try." He spent the next 6 hours crafting a lie that felt like truth. Troop positions that were almost right. Supply caches that existed but were empty. A timeline that gave Torvin just enough warning to disappear if he was smart about it. When dawn came, Cassian delivered the information to Meera with a face that gave away nothing. She read it carefully, then nodded. "This will do. Your wagon is ready in the courtyard. Travel safe, Duke Vale. And remember, if I discover you've deceived me, there's nowhere you can hide." "I understand." He and Isolda loaded their minimal belongings into the wagon and prepared to leave. As they climbed onto the driver's seat, Cassian looked back at the Crossroads Inn one last time. Meera stood in the window of her third-floor room, watching them with an expression he couldn't read. Then they were moving, the wagon rolling out of the courtyard and onto the eastern road that promised escape or just a different flavor of imprisonment. They traveled in silence for the first hour, both too exhausted to speak. Finally, Isolda broke the quiet. "Do you think Torvin will figure it out in time?" "I sent him a coded warning before we left. If he's still the man I think he is, he'll recognize the pattern and relocate. And if he doesn't, then I've killed my best friend to buy us a few more weeks of running. That's not—" "Yes, it is. Don't try to soften it." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I've put you in a position where these are the choices you have to make. You didn't put me anywhere. I chose this. I chose you. Everything that's happened since is just consequence." The road ahead stretched into distance that looked like freedom, but felt like something else entirely. Behind them, the Crossroads Inn grew smaller until it disappeared around a bend. And somewhere in that building, Lady Meera was reading intelligence that would reshape the North and planning moves that Cassian couldn't see coming. He'd bought time and passage with betrayal and deception. Now he just had to live long enough to discover if the price had been worth paying. So, 3 days into their journey east, the wagon's axle broke. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by scrubland that offered no shelter and no help. Cassian examined the damage and understood immediately that it wasn't an accident. The axle had been deliberately weakened, a clean saw cut hidden beneath layers of grease and dirt. Someone had sabotaged the wagon before they'd even left the Crossroads Inn. "Meera," he said quietly, "she never intended to let us escape." Isolde climbed down from the wagon, moving carefully. "What do we do?" "We walk. It's 20 miles to the next settlement. If we move fast, we can make it before dark." "I can't walk 20 miles in my condition." "Then I'll carry you." "Cassian, that's not a request." He rigged a makeshift pack from their supplies and helped Isolda onto his back. She protested, but he ignored her, starting down the road with steady determination. They made it 5 miles before the riders appeared. There were 6 of them, professional soldiers by the look of their equipment. They rode in formation, cutting off any escape route. The lead rider dismounted and approached with casual confidence. His face was scarred and weathered, the face of someone who'd done terrible things and slept fine afterward. "Duke Cassian Vale," the man said. "Lady Meera sends her regards. She wanted me to tell you that she appreciates the intelligence you provided, but she's decided that loose ends are bad for business." He drew his sword, and the other riders followed suit. Cassian set Isolda down gently and drew his own blade. "Stay behind me," he told her. "There's 6 of them." "I know. You can't win this." "Probably not, but I'm going to try anyway." The lead rider smiled. "That's the spirit. Die with dignity. It's more than most traitors get." Then they attacked. Cassian met them with the cold precision that had made him legendary, his blade moving in patterns that were more instinct than thought. The first man died before he understood what was happening. The second managed to parry twice before Cassian's sword opened his throat. But there were still 4 more, and Cassian was already breathing hard. They came at him from multiple angles, coordinated and professional. He took a cut across his shoulder that burned like fire, another slash across his thigh that made his leg go numb. He was losing. Behind him, Isolda screamed. Cassian turned and saw one of the riders dragging her toward a horse. She fought with desperate fury, but the man was twice her size and trained for this. Something broke inside Cassian then. Not his body, though that was failing too. Something deeper. The last fragment of control that had kept him functioning through betrayal and exile and the slow erosion of everything he'd ever valued. He stopped fighting like a trained soldier and started fighting like an animal. The change was immediate and terrifying. His movements lost their precision but gained something more primal. Pure aggression in service of survival. He took wounds that should have stopped him and didn't even slow down. 2 more riders fell before the others understood what they were facing. The lead rider backed away, reassessing. He gestured to his remaining companion, and they pulled Isolda between them like a shield. "Drop your sword or we kill her," the leader said. "Your choice." Cassian stood in the middle of the road, bleeding from a dozen wounds, breathing in ragged gasps. His sword felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He looked at Isolda. Her face was pale but determined. She met his eyes and gave the smallest shake of her head. "Don't," she mouthed. The lead rider pressed his blade against her throat, drawing a thin line of blood. "I said drop it." Cassian's fingers loosened on the sword hilt. And in that moment, watching the blood run down Isolda's neck, seeing the child she carried threatened by men who saw them both as nothing more than obstacles to profit, Cassian understood something fundamental about power and survival, and the choices that define who you become. You couldn't negotiate with people who saw you as currency. You couldn't reason with systems built on exploitation. You couldn't compromise your way out of situations where the other side had already decided you were disposable. The only option left was to become something they couldn't control, something they couldn't predict, something that scared them more than they scared you. His sword hit the ground with a metallic ring. The lead rider smiled. "Smart man. Now walk away and maybe we'll let you live." Cassian started walking, not away from them, toward them. "What are you doing?" the leader demanded. "I said walk away." Cassian kept coming, empty hands at his sides, blood running down his arms, eyes locked on the man holding Isolda. "Stop, or she dies." Cassian didn't stop. The leader's confidence faltered. He pressed the blade harder against Isolda's throat. "I'll do it. I swear I'll do it." "Then do it," Cassian said. And his voice was empty of everything except certainty. "Kill her and find out what happens next." The bluff worked for exactly 3 seconds. Then the leader understood he wasn't bluffing. The man's grip on Isolda loosened fractionally, just enough. She drove her elbow backward into his ribs and dropped to the ground. Cassian closed the distance before the rider could recover. What happened next was brutal and efficient and completely without mercy. Cassian killed the leader with his bare hands, broke the other rider's neck with a movement he'd learned in the border wars, and stood over the bodies breathing like he'd just run a marathon. Isolda stared at him from the ground, her hand pressed against the cut on her throat. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and his voice sounded strange even to himself. "Just the cut. It's not deep." He helped her to her feet, noting the way she flinched slightly when he touched her, like he'd become something she wasn't sure she recognized anymore. They stood surrounded by corpses in the middle of nowhere, and Cassian understood that he'd finally crossed the line that separated civilization from savagery. He'd become the thing he'd spent his entire life trying to avoid, a man with nothing left to lose. And that, he realized, made him more dangerous than any army the Crown could send. Cassian stood among the bodies and understood that survival had stripped him down to something elemental and unrecognizable. Blood ran down his arms in rivulets that dripped from his fingertips onto frozen ground. His breathing came in ragged gasps that tore at his throat. Every wound he'd taken pulsed with heat that felt like his body was trying to cook itself from the inside out. But he was alive, and Isolda was alive. And that was all that mattered in a world that had been reduced to those 2 fundamental truths. "We need to move," he said, his voice rough. "More will come." Isolda pressed her hand against the cut on her throat, blood seeping between her fingers. She looked at him with eyes that held something he'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, something closer to recognition, like she was finally seeing what he'd always been underneath the political polish and aristocratic bearing, a killer who'd learned to wear crowns. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes." "Then we go. Now." They left the bodies where they fell, taking weapons and supplies from the dead, because practicality mattered more than dignity. Cassian strapped 2 swords to his back and filled pouches with dried food and water skins. Isolda moved with mechanical precision, her face pale but composed. The nearest settlement was still 15 miles east. They started walking. The first mile passed in silence, broken only by the sound of boots on frozen earth and breathing that was too labored to be healthy. Cassian felt each wound with crystalline clarity, his body cataloging damage and calculating how much further it could be pushed before systems started failing. The answer wasn't encouraging. By the second mile, his vision started blurring at the edges. Blood loss, probably. Or exhaustion. Or both. He forced himself to focus on the horizon, on putting one foot in front of the other, on the simple mechanical process of continuing to exist. Behind him, Isolda stumbled. He turned and caught her before she hit the ground. Her face was gray, her breathing shallow. When he pressed his hand against her forehead, her skin felt like ice. "How far along are you?" he asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. 5 months, maybe 6. "You need a physician. I need a lot of things I'm not going to get." He looked down the road ahead, then back the way they'd come. No shelter in either direction. No help. No options except forward or death. So forward it was. He rigged another makeshift carry using torn fabric from one of the dead soldiers and got Isolda onto his back. She protested weakly, but he ignored her, starting down the road with determination that was more stubbornness than strategy. The 3rd mile nearly killed him. His legs stopped communicating with his brain properly. Several times he found himself on his knees without remembering falling. Each time, he forced himself back up, adjusted Isolda's weight, and kept moving. Because stopping meant accepting defeat, and he'd spent too many years winning to remember how to lose gracefully. Somewhere during the 4th mile, Isolda spoke against his ear, her voice barely above a whisper. "Put me down." "No." "Cassian, you're dying." "Not yet. You can't carry me another 11 miles. Watch me." She laughed, and it sounded like something breaking. "You're the most stubborn man I've ever met. That's not a compliment." "I know." The sun was setting when he finally saw smoke on the horizon. Multiple columns, indicating civilization of some kind. He adjusted his grip on Isolda and pushed forward with reserves he didn't know he had. The settlement materialized out of the failing light like something from a fever dream. It was larger than Varna's Rest, more permanent, with actual stone buildings and walls that looked designed to withstand sieges rather than just weather. Guards stood at the gate, wearing uniforms that Cassian didn't recognize. They watched his approach with weapons ready, taking in the blood-soaked stranger carrying an unconscious woman. The lead guard stepped forward, a woman with sergeant's stripes, and a face that suggested she'd seen worse things than whatever Cassian presented. "State your business," she said. "Sanctuary. And a physician. In that order. Who are you?" "Nobody important." The sergeant looked him over carefully, cataloging wounds and weapons. Her eyes lingered on the quality of his armor, on the veil crest still visible beneath layers of dirt and blood. "You're Duke Cassian Vale," she said. "There's a bounty on your head." "I know. So why shouldn't I collect it?" "Because I'll kill you before you finish drawing that sword." It wasn't a threat. It was just information. A simple statement of fact delivered with the casual certainty of someone who'd moved beyond bluffing. The sergeant studied him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. "The physician's quarters are in the central building. Tell Marin I sent you." "And Duke Vale?" "The bounty says dead or alive. Remember that before you start killing people in my settlement?" "Understood." He walked through the gate with Isolda still unconscious on his back, moving past curious stares and whispered conversations. The settlement had the feel of a military outpost, disciplined and organized in ways that civilian towns never managed. He found the physician's quarters and kicked open the door because his hands were too occupied with keeping Isolda from falling. A man looked up from where he was grinding herbs, his expression shifting from annoyance to alarm in the space of a heartbeat. "I need help," Cassian said. Then he collapsed, and the world turned to static. He woke to pain that felt comprehensive and specific simultaneously. Every wound announced itself individually. The slash across his shoulder, the cut on his thigh, the dozen smaller injuries he'd accumulated without noticing. His body felt like it had been disassembled and put back together by someone who'd lost the instruction manual. He was in a bed, clean and bandaged, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and dying flowers. Isolda sat in a chair beside him, alive and awake, her hand pressed protectively against her stomach. "You're conscious," she said when she saw his eyes open. "Marin thought you might sleep for another day." "How long have I been out?" 18 hours. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his shoulder. Isolda reached out to steady him, her touch gentle. "Easy. You lost a lot of blood." Marin said another hour and you would have died from blood loss alone. Where are we? A settlement called Riven's Gate. It's a mercenary outpost, technically neutral, but practically whoever pays the best rent. We're safe for now. For now being the critical phrase. Always. He looked at her carefully, taking in the color that had returned to her cheeks, the steadiness of her breathing. The physician is good? Better than good. She's treated everything from arrow wounds to plague. She says the baby is fine, stressed, but fine. And you? Isolda was quiet for a moment. I'm alive. That's more than I expected 3 days ago. Cassian swung his legs over the side of the bed, testing his body's willingness to cooperate. Everything hurt, but everything also worked, which was better than it had any right to be. We can't stay here long, he said. The bounty will draw hunters. Merrin knows. She's given us 3 days before we become a liability she can't afford. 3 days to do what? Figure out our next move. He stood carefully, using the wall for support. Through the window he could see Riven's Gate stretching out in organized rows. Soldiers trained in a courtyard. Merchants haggled in the market square. Life continuing with mechanical efficiency. We're out of moves, he said quietly. Meera has intelligence about the north. The crown has us marked for execution. We have no allies, no resources, no leverage. The only thing we have is the ability to keep running until we can't anymore. Then we stop running. He turned to look at her. What? We stop running. We turn around and fight. Fight who? With what army? Isolda, I have 3 exhausted soldiers back in Varna's Rest and a body that's held together with stitches and stubbornness. I can't wage war against the crown. No, but you can wage war against the Grand Chancellor. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Cassian crossed the room and sat down heavily in the chair Isolda had vacated. Explain. She moved to stand by the window, her silhouette backlit by afternoon sun. The Grand Chancellor is the real threat. The king is weak, reactive. Aldrich doesn't want you dead because he fears you. He wants you dead because Theron Varric convinced him you're a threat to stability. So? So what happens if Theron's credibility collapses? What happens if the king discovers that his Grand Chancellor has been manipulating events to increase his own power? The alliance between them fractures. The king looks for new advisors. The political landscape shifts. Exactly. Cassian considered this, running scenarios through his head with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years playing political chess. And how do we collapse Theron's credibility from a mercenary outpost with no intelligence network and no access to court? Isolda turned away from the window and met his eyes. We use the one piece of leverage we still have. The information you gave to Lady Meera. That information is what makes us traitors. Only if it reaches the crown without context. But what if we intercept it first? What if we get to the king before Meera does and present the intelligence ourselves, framed as evidence that Theron was planning to use it to stage a coup? That's insane. Probably. But do you have a better option? He wanted to say yes. Wanted to present some brilliant alternative strategy that didn't involve walking directly into the heart of enemy territory and gambling everything on a political maneuver that had maybe a 10% chance of success. But he had nothing. How do we even get to the king? He asked. We're wanted fugitives. We can't just ride up to the palace and request an audience. We don't go to the palace. We go to the Winter Assembly. The what? Isolda sat down across from him, her expression intense. The Winter Assembly is a gathering of all the provincial lords that happens every 5 years. It's scheduled to begin in 2 weeks at the neutral grounds between the northern and southern territories. Every duke, every chancellor, every minor noble with a grievance attends, including the king. So we walk into a room full of people who want us dead and hope for the best? We walk into a room full of people who are terrified of civil war and present them with evidence that the Grand Chancellor has been planning exactly that. Then we let their self-interest do the work. It was crazy. It was also the first idea anyone had presented that didn't end with them freezing to death in the wilderness or getting executed for treason. We'd need proof, Cassian said. Real evidence that Theron was planning to use the intelligence against the crown. We have that. The documents Lady Meera prepared included annotations in her own hand detailing how the intelligence could be used to destabilize the North. If we can retrieve those documents and present them alongside testimony about Theron's involvement, it paints a picture of conspiracy. And how do we retrieve documents from a woman who already tried to have us killed? We steal them from the Crossroads Inn. which is probably guarded by Meera's people and anyone else she's hired to finish what the road ambush started. Yes. Cassian stood and walked to the window, staring out at Riven's gate. The settlement was busy with the kind of purposeful activity that came from people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. Mercenaries preparing for contracts, merchants calculating profit margins, the machinery of survival operating with cold efficiency. He thought about Torvin, still hiding somewhere in the north with whatever remained of Cassian's forces. Thought about the men who died following him into exile. Thought about the kingdom he'd abandoned and the woman he'd chosen over duty. Thought about whether redemption was even possible after everything he'd destroyed. When he turned back to Isolda, he'd made his decision. "We'll need help," he said. "Real soldiers, not just the two of us playing commando." Isolda smiled, and it looked genuine for the first time in weeks. "Then it's good we're in a settlement full of mercenaries." Assembling a team took 2 days, and most of the gold they'd stolen from Meera's dead soldiers. The mercenaries of Riven's Gate operated on simple economics. If you paid well and the target was achievable, they'd take the contract. Loyalty was purchased by the hour, and morality was someone else's problem. Cassian found himself sitting across a table from a woman named Kael Voss, who ran the largest mercenary company in the settlement. She was in her 40s, built like a siege weapon, with scars that told stories of battles survived through skill and luck in equal measure. "You want to hit the crossroads inn, retrieve specific documents, and get out without dying," Kael said, her tone suggesting this was marginally more interesting than watching paint dry. "That's going to be expensive." "How expensive?" 10,000 for planning and execution. Another 5 if you want us to provide distraction and covering fire during exfiltration. I have 12,000 total. Then you'll get planning, execution, and half-assed distraction. Take it or leave it." Cassian considered the numbers. 12,000 was everything they had. If this failed, they'd be broke and probably dead. If it succeeded, they might actually have a chance. "I'll take it," he said. Kael smiled. "Smart man. We move in 3 days. That gives us time to scout the location and plan approach vectors." "I'm coming with you." "No, you're not. You're wounded, exhausted, and emotionally compromised. You'd be a liability. It's not negotiable. Everything is negotiable. But fine. You come, you follow orders, and if you get yourself killed, I'm not refunding the contract fee." "Understood." They shook on it, and Cassian walked out of the meeting feeling like he'd just purchased either salvation or an expensive suicide. Isolda was waiting in their room, pacing with nervous energy. "It's done," Cassian said. "We move in 3 days." "And me?" "You stay here. Under guard. Safe." She turned on him with fire in her eyes. "I'm not some fragile thing that needs protecting. I can fight. You're 5 months pregnant. You're not fighting. That's not your decision." "Yes, it is. Because if something happens to you, everything we've sacrificed becomes meaningless. You're the only reason I'm still alive, the only reason I'm still trying. I need you to stay safe." The anger in her expression softened into something more complicated. "You mean that? Every word?" She crossed the room and pressed her forehead against his chest. "I hate this. I hate being useless." "You're not useless. You're the reason we have a plan at all. But plans only work if we both survive to execute them." "Promise me you'll come back." "I can't promise that." "Then promise me you'll try. That I can do." They stood together in the small room, holding on to each other like drowning people clutching wreckage. Outside, Riven's Gate prepared for nightfall, and somewhere to the west, the Crossroads Inn waited with documents that could either save them or condemn them. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Cassian trained with Kael's mercenaries, running through entry points and fallback positions until his body remembered the movements without conscious thought. His wounds protested every exercise. But pain was just information, and information could be ignored if your motivation was strong enough. Isolda spent the time gathering intelligence from traveling merchants, piecing together information about the Winter Assembly and which lords might be sympathetic to their cause. She worked with focused intensity, transforming their desperate gamble into something that resembled an actual strategy. On the morning of the 3rd day, Cassian woke before dawn and prepared for war. He dressed in dark leathers designed for mobility rather than protection, strapped knives to his thighs and forearms, checked his sword 3 times to ensure the blade was sharp and the hilt secure. The ritual of preparation was almost meditative, each action grounding him in the physical reality of what was coming. Isolda watched from the bed, her expression unreadable. "Come back to me," she said simply. "Always." He kissed her once, hard and desperate, then walked out before emotion could interfere with necessity. Kale and her team were waiting in the courtyard. 12 mercenaries, all veterans, all wearing the kind of expressions that said they'd done this before and survived. They mounted horses and rode out of Riven's Gate as the sun broke over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and copper. The journey to the Crossroads Inn took 6 hours of hard riding. They approached from the north, using terrain features to mask their approach. A mile out, Kale called for a halt and climbed a ridge to scout. When she came back, her expression was grim. Meera's tripled her security. "I count at least 20 guards, maybe more inside. This is going to be harder than we thought. Can it be done?" "Everything can be done if you're willing to pay the price. Question is whether you're willing." Cassian looked at this ridge where the Crossroads Inn sat like a fortress. Smoke rose from its chimneys in lazy spirals. From this distance, it looked peaceful, inviting even. He knew better. "What's the plan?" he asked. Kale sketched it out in the dirt. "Frontal assault to draw attention. Secondary team enters through the kitchen. You go in with the secondary team, find your documents, get out. We hold the line for 10 minutes, then full retreat regardless of whether you've succeeded. 10 minutes isn't much. It's what you paid for. Use it wisely." They waited until full dark, then moved into position. Cassian's heart hammered against his ribs as they approached the inn from the east. Every shadow looked like an ambush. Every sound suggested discovery. His hand never left his sword hilt. The frontal assault started with fire arrows into the stable, creating immediate chaos. Guards rushed toward the flames, shouting orders and scrambling for water. In the confusion, Cassian and 3 mercenaries slipped through the kitchen entrance. Inside, the inn was warm and crowded. Travelers drinking in the common room, servants moving between tables. The mundane machinery of hospitality operating without awareness of the violence about to erupt. Meera's office is on the 3rd floor, Cassian whispered to his team. East side. They climbed the stairs with weapons drawn, moving with practiced silence. At the 2nd floor landing, they encountered 2 guards who died before they could raise an alarm. The 3rd floor was quieter, almost abandoned. Cassian moved down this hallway, counting doors until he reached the one that matched Meera's room from his previous visit. It was locked. He kicked it open. The room was empty. No Meera. No documents. Just furniture and the lingering smell of perfume. "It's a trap," one of the mercenaries said. The realization hit Cassian like cold water. Meera had known they were coming, had prepared for it. The whole setup was designed to draw him in and kill him. Behind them, the door to the hallway slammed shut. Men poured out of adjacent rooms, armed and ready. Not guards. Professional soldiers wearing crown insignia. Cassian counted 12 before he stopped counting and started fighting. The close quarters turned the battle into something vicious and intimate. No room for grand tactics or strategic positioning, just brutal application of violence in service of staying alive one more second. Cassian's sword became an extension of desperation, cutting and parrying with movements burned into muscle memory. One of the mercenaries went down with a spear through his chest. Another took a blade across the throat and collapsed, choking on his own blood. They were losing. Cassian felt it in the rhythm of combat, in the way space kept compressing, in the growing certainty that this was the end. Then Kale appeared in the doorway behind the crowned soldiers, leading the rest of her team. The battle shifted, confusion replacing coordination as the crown forces found themselves caught between 2 groups. "Move!" Kale shouted at Cassian. "Find what you came for and get out!" He didn't waste time arguing. He pushed through the chaos toward what looked like an administrative office at the end of the hall. The door was reinforced, designed to withstand forced entry. He hit it with his shoulder anyway. The wood cracked but held. He hit it again, ignoring pain that screamed through his wounded shoulder. On the 3rd impact, the door gave way and he stumbled into a room lined with filing cabinets and document storage. Papers everywhere. Ledgers. Correspondence. The accumulated bureaucracy of an information network. He started searching with methodical desperation, pulling drawers open and scanning contents. Most of it was routine intelligence about trade routes and merchant movements. Nothing useful. Then he found a locked drawer. He He broke it open with his sword pommel and pulled out a leather portfolio tied with ribbon. Inside were documents in Meera's handwriting, annotated maps showing northern fortifications, and correspondence with someone identified only as TV Theron Varric. The documents detailed a plan to use the intelligence Cassian had provided to stage attacks on northern supply lines that would be blamed on Crown forces. The goal was to push the North into open rebellion, creating chaos that Theron could exploit to consolidate power. It was everything they needed. Cassian stuffed the portfolio inside his jacket and turned to leave. Lady Meera stood in the doorway, holding a crossbow aimed at his chest. "You're persistent," she said. "I'll give you that." Most men would have accepted death by now. Most men don't have as much to lose, or as much to answer for. "Tell me, Duke Vale, how does it feel knowing you betrayed everything you claim to stand for?" "It feels like survival. You should understand that. I understand perfectly. That's why I can't let you leave with those documents." Her finger tightened on the trigger. Cassian dove left as the bolt released, feeling it pass close enough to his head that the displacement of air was tangible. He rolled to his feet and charged, closing distance before she could reload. They collided hard, both going down in a tangle of limbs and weapons. Meera fought with the savage efficiency of someone who'd learned combat in back alleys and forgotten battlefields. She got a knife into his side, shallow but painful. He drove his elbow into her face, felt bone crunch, pushed her away and scrambled backward. They faced each other across the small office, both breathing hard, both bleeding. "This doesn't change anything," Meera said, blood running from her broken nose. "Theron will still win. The North will still burn. You've just delayed the inevitable." "Maybe. But delay is all I need." He left her there and ran back into the hallway where the fighting had devolved into pure chaos. Kyle was holding a position at the stairs, her team forming a defensive line that was slowly being compressed. "We're leaving," Cassian shouted. "Now!" The retreat was a running battle down 3 flights of stairs and through a common room full of screaming civilians. Cassian felt blades catch him twice more, adding to the collection of wounds that would probably kill him if they didn't get treatment soon. They burst out into the night where horses waited, mounted, and rode into darkness with Crown soldiers and Meera's mercenaries in pursuit. The chase lasted for miles, shots fired in darkness, horses pushed beyond safe limits. 2 more of Kyle's team went down before they finally lost their pursuers in a network of ravines. When they finally stopped to assess casualties, Cassian's team had been reduced from 12 to 7. The price kept climbing, but clutched against his chest, soaked with his blood, were documents that could reshape the political landscape of the entire kingdom. If they could survive long enough to use them. They limped back into Riven's Gate 3 days before the winter assembly was scheduled to begin. Cassian's wounds had become infected during the ride, turning his body into a furnace that cooked him from the inside out. He barely remembered the last day of travel, consciousness bleeding into delirium and back again. Isolda met them at the gate, her face going white when she saw the state he was in. "Get him to Marin," she told Kael. "Now." The physician worked on him for 6 hours, cleaning wounds that had started to rot, stitching flesh that should have been treated days ago. When she finally stepped back, her expression was professionally neutral in a way that suggested bad news delivered gently. "He'll live," Marin said, "but he won't be riding anywhere for at least a week. The assembly is in 3 days, Isolda said. "Then he's not attending the assembly." Cassian opened his eyes, fighting through fever that made the room swim. "I'm attending. You're barely conscious." "I'll manage. You'll die. Probably. But I'll die after delivering those documents." Marin looked at Isolda. "He's delirious. Don't let him make decisions in this state." But Isolda was staring at Cassian with an expression that held equal parts admiration and terror. "He's not delirious. He's just decided that some things matter more than survival." She turned to Marin. "Can you keep him alive for 3 more days?" "Alive?" "Yes." "Functional?" "That's asking a lot." "Then keep him alive. We'll worry about functional when we get there." The next 72 hours passed in a haze of fever and forced recovery. Cassian drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting infections that wanted to kill him while Marin pumped him full of medicines that tasted like concentrated bitterness. When he was lucid, Isolda sat beside him and went over their strategy for the assembly. "You'll present the documents to the king directly," she said, "in front of all the assembled lords. Public enough that Theron can't suppress it, formal enough that it can't be dismissed as rumor. And if the king doesn't believe me, then we've failed and will probably be executed. But at least we'll have tried. That's not encouraging. It's not meant to be. It's just true. On the morning of the assembly, Cassian woke feeling marginally more human. The fever had broken during the night, leaving him weak but clear-headed. Isolda helped him dress in clothing that approximated formal wear, covering most of his visible wounds. The leather portfolio containing Meera's documents went into a satchel that never left his sight. "You don't have to do this," she said as she helped him with his jacket. "We could run, disappear into the eastern provinces and never look back, and spend the rest of our lives wondering if we could have made a difference. Some people live long, comfortable lives by not making differences. I'm not some people." She smiled sadly. "No, you're really not." They rode out of Riven's Gate as the sun rose, heading toward the neutral grounds where the winter assembly would convene. Kael provided an escort of 5 mercenaries, paid for with money they didn't have, but would owe forever if they survived. The journey took 8 hours. By the time they arrived, Cassian's wounds had reopened and his jacket was soaked with blood from the inside. The assembly grounds were impressive, a massive pavilion erected on flat ground between the northern and southern territories. Hundreds of lords and their retinues filled the space, creating a dense crowd of political power and barely restrained hostility. Cassian dismounted carefully, using his horse for support. Around him, nobles recognized the Iron Duke who'd become a wanted fugitive. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Security forces moved toward him, hands on weapons. "I'm here under right of assembly," Cassian called out, his voice carrying across the pavilion. "Any noble may address grievances before the king. That right supersedes bounties and warrants." The security forces hesitated, caught between duty and protocol. Then a voice cut through the tension like a blade through flesh. "Let him approach." King Aldrich stood at the center of the pavilion, flanked by advisors and guards. He was younger than Cassian expected, maybe 40, with the kind of face that suggested intelligence trapped in circumstances beyond its control. Beside him stood Grand Chancellor Theron Varric, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. Cassian walked forward through a crowd that parted like he was infectious. Each step sent pain lancing through his body, but he forced himself to move with dignity, with purpose. He stopped 10 feet from the king and bowed formally, ignoring the blood that dripped from beneath his jacket onto white marble. "Your Majesty," he said, "I come before this assembly to present evidence of treason at the highest levels of your government." Theron's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Calculation, concern. "These are serious accusations, Duke Vale," the king said, "especially from a man wanted for abandoning his post and breaking a crown-sanctioned betrothal. I understand the charges against me. Your Majesty, I'm prepared to answer for them. But first, I ask that you review these documents." Cassian pulled the leather portfolio from his satchel and held it out. A guard stepped forward to take it, but Theron interrupted. "Your Majesty, this man is a fugitive and a traitor. Whatever he's carrying is likely fabricated in a desperate attempt to avoid execution." "Then let the documents speak for themselves," Cassian said. "If they're fabrications, that will be obvious." The king gestured, and the guard brought him the portfolio. Aldrich opened it and began reading, his expression growing darker with each page. The pavilion fell silent except for the sound of paper rustling and distant wind. Finally, the king looked up. "These documents suggest that my Grand Chancellor has been conspiring with foreign intelligence networks to destabilize the northern provinces." Theron stepped forward smoothly. "Your Majesty, I've never seen these documents before. They're clearly forgeries designed to sow discord." "The handwriting is yours," Cassian said. "The annotations match correspondence you've sent to provincial governors. The details are too specific to be fabricated, circumstantial at best." The king held up one particular page. "This letter is addressed to you, Theron. It discusses using northern intelligence to stage false flag attacks that would be blamed on crown forces. How do you explain this?" Theron's composure cracked slightly. "I explain it as an obvious forgery. Duke Vale has every reason to lie. But I don't have the ability to forge your handwriting or knowledge of intelligence operations I was never privy to." The assembled lords began murmuring, whispers building into audible speculation. Theron turned to the king. "Your Majesty, I've served your family for 30 years. I've never given you reason to doubt my loyalty. This man abandoned his duties and fled with a woman he had no right to touch. He's desperate and dangerous." Cassian felt his strength fading, blood loss and exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline. But he forced himself to stay standing, to keep eye contact with the king. Your Majesty, everything the Grand Chancellor says about me is true. I did abandon my post, I did break the betrothal, I did all of this because I chose the woman I love over political convenience. He paused, letting that sink in. But that doesn't make these documents any less real. Theron Varric has been manipulating events to increase his own power. The arranged marriage was never about strengthening the kingdom. It was about putting his daughter in a position to influence the North while he maintained control of the South. Prove it, Theron said coldly. The proof is in the documents, in the patterns of manipulation, in the fact that every action you've taken over the last 5 years has consolidated power in your hands while weakening the king's direct control. The king was silent, studying both men. Then he spoke, his voice carrying absolute authority. Grand Chancellor Varric, you are hereby suspended from all duties pending investigation into these allegations. Duke Vale, you are under arrest for desertion and betrayal of crown trust. Both of you will submit to formal inquiry. Guards moved forward to take them into custody, and in that moment, with everything hanging in balance, Cassian understood that he'd done all he could. The documents were in the king's hands. The truth was exposed. What happened next was beyond his control. He looked across the pavilion and found Isolda standing at the edge of the crowd, her hand pressed against her stomach, tears running down her face. Their eyes met across distance and chaos. He smiled. Then his legs gave out and he collapsed onto marble that was already stained with his blood. Consciousness fading into darkness that felt less like dying and more like finally being allowed to rest. The last thing he heard was Isolda screaming his name, and the last thing he thought was that maybe, just maybe, the price had been worth paying after all. Cassian woke to whiteness. Not the white of snow or marble or clean fabric, the white of emptiness, of consciousness struggling to reassemble itself from fragments. For a moment he existed without memory or context, just awareness floating in void. Then pain arrived like an old friend returning from a long journey, announcing itself in every nerve ending simultaneously. He was alive. That realization came with complicated feelings. The room materialized around him gradually. Stone walls, a narrow window showing gray sky, the smell of antiseptic and something herbal that reminded him of Marin's medicines. He was in a bed, clean and bandaged, in what looked like a cell that someone had tried to make comfortable. Prison, then. But prison with medical care, which suggested he hadn't been condemned to execution. Yet, the door opened and Isolda entered carrying a tray with food and water. She looked thinner than he remembered, her face carrying new lines that hadn't been there before. When she saw him awake, something crumpled in her expression, and she set down the tray with shaking hands. "You're awake," she said, and her voice broke on the second word. "How long?" 3 weeks. You've been unconscious for 3 weeks. The physicians said the blood loss and infection should have killed you. They said you were too stubborn to die. Sounds accurate. She crossed to the bed and sat carefully on the edge, her hand reaching for his face like she needed to confirm he was real. Her fingers were cold against his cheek. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "When you collapsed at the assembly, there was so much blood. I thought you were dead. Takes more than that to kill me." Apparently. She pulled her hand back and folded both hands in her lap with careful precision, the gesture suggesting she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "What happened after I passed out?" Cassian asked. Isolde took a breath that sounded like it hurt. The king ordered a formal investigation. Grand Chancellor Varric was placed under house arrest. You were brought here to the Crown's medical facility and kept under guard. For 3 weeks, nobody would tell me if you were going to survive or if they were just keeping you alive long enough to stand trial. And the documents? Verified. Experts confirmed the handwriting, cross-referenced the intelligence with known operations. Everything you presented was accurate. Theron tried to claim it was all taken out of context, but the evidence was overwhelming. So he's finished. Not quite. He still has allies in the southern provinces. Lords who benefit from his policies and fear what comes next. But his position as Grand Chancellor is done. The king has called for a full restructuring of the Advisory Council. Cassian processed this, running political calculations that felt rusty from disuse. And us? What happens to us? That's complicated. The door opened again and King Aldrich entered, flanked by 2 guards but not acting like a man who expected violence. He was dressed simply, without the ceremonial robes Cassian had seen at the assembly. Up close, he looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Duke Vale," the king said, "you're finally conscious. My physicians were beginning to think you preferred sleeping to facing consequences." "Consequences tend to be easier when you're unconscious." "A fair point." Aldrich gestured to Isolde. "Lady Meera, would you give us privacy?" She stood reluctantly, looking at Cassian with an expression that said she didn't trust the king alone with him. He nodded slightly, and she left, the door closing with finality behind her. The king pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down with the casual ease of someone comfortable with power. For a moment he just studied Cassian, his eyes cataloging wounds and exhaustion. "You put me in a difficult position," he said finally. "I put you in an informed position. Whether that's difficult depends on what you choose to do with the information." Aldrich smiled slightly. "My advisors said you were direct to the point of rudeness. They weren't exaggerating. When you've lost everything, politeness feels like wasted effort." "Have you lost everything?" "From where I'm sitting, you exposed a conspiracy at the highest levels of government, potentially saved the kingdom from civil war, and survived injuries that should have killed you 3 times over. That doesn't sound like losing. I abandoned my post, broke a crown-sanctioned betrothal, killed men in service of protecting a woman I had no legal claim to. Those aren't the actions of someone who should be rewarded. No, they're the actions of someone who chose human connection over political expedience, which is either the worst kind of weakness or the rarest kind of strength, depending on perspective." "And what's your perspective, Your Majesty?" The king was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands like they held answers. When he spoke, his voice carried weight that went beyond royal authority. "My father arranged my marriage when I was 17, he said, "to a woman I'd never met from a kingdom I'd never visited. She was beautiful and intelligent and completely wrong for me. We spent 20 years in a partnership that was politically successful and personally hollow. She died 3 years ago, and I realized I'd never actually known her, never tried to. The marriage was a transaction, and we both honored it like any other contract." He looked up at Cassian. "I envied you when I heard what you'd done. Running away with the woman you loved, consequences be damned. It was stupid and reckless and everything a ruler shouldn't do. But it was also honest in a way that most of us never achieve. Honesty doesn't build stable kingdoms. No. But dishonesty doesn't build anything worth keeping." Cassian tried to sit up straighter and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his shoulder. The king gestured for him to stay still. "Here's my problem," Aldrich continued. "You're technically guilty of everything you've been charged with. I should execute you or exile you at minimum. But doing so sends a message that exposing corruption is less important than maintaining appearances. It tells every noble in the kingdom that loyalty to broken systems matters more than truth. So what are you going to do? I'm going to offer you a choice. You can return to Blackmore as Duke of the Northern Borderlands, with full restoration of titles and lands. The betrothal to Celine Varick is dissolved, obviously. You'll be free to marry Lady Isolde if you choose, and any children you have will be legitimate heirs. And the cost? The cost is that you'll owe me. Not in the transactional sense that Theron would have demanded, but in the sense that I need men who understand the difference between duty and obedience, who can be trusted to tell me when I'm wrong instead of just following orders. The kingdom is fracturing, and I need advisors who aren't afraid to bleed for what they believe. You want me on your council. I want you alive and functional, and using that tactical mind for something other than survival." Cassian considered this. It was everything he'd lost, being handed back with minimal strings attached. It should have felt like victory, like redemption, like the universe acknowledging that his choices had been right. Instead, it felt like a trap lined with good intentions. "What's the alternative?" he asked. "You and Lady Isolda are given safe passage to the eastern provinces. A modest pension, enough to live comfortably but not ostentatiously. Complete freedom from the crown and all its obligations. You'd be commoners, effectively invisible to the political structures that nearly killed you. Exile disguised as mercy, freedom disguised as consequence." They stared at each other across the small space, 2 men from different worlds trying to find common language. "How long do I have to decide?" Cassian asked. "Until you're recovered enough to travel. The physicians say another 2 weeks at minimum. Use that time to think about what kind of life you actually want, instead of just reacting to whatever crisis comes next." The king stood and walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you did the right thing. Not the smart thing or the strategic thing, but the right thing. That's rarer than you'd think in positions of power. Then he was gone, leaving Cassian alone with a choice that felt heavier than any crown. Isolda returned an hour later with fresh bandages and an expression that suggested she'd been crying. She worked in silence, changing dressings with practiced efficiency. Her hands were steady, but Cassian could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like glass that might shatter if handled roughly. "The king offered me Blackmore back," he said finally. Her hands stilled. "I know. He told me before he came to see you. What do you think I should do?" She finished tying off a bandage before answering. "I think you should do whatever lets you sleep at night. We've spent the last 2 months running and fighting and barely surviving. Maybe it's time to stop and figure out who we are when we're not in crisis mode. And who are we?" "I don't know. That's what scares me." She sat down heavily in the chair the king had vacated. "When I first met you, you were the Iron Duke. Untouchable. Unshakable. So certain of your place in the world that it radiated from you like heat. Now you're a man who's lost everything and might get it back if he's willing to accept conditions. I don't know which version is real. Both are real. People aren't consistent. We're just collections of choices made under different circumstances. That's a very political answer. I'm a very political person." "Are you, though? Because political people don't abandon kingdoms for women they love. They make calculated decisions and live with the consequences." Cassian struggled to sit up, ignoring pain and Isolda's protests. He needed to be at eye level for this conversation, needed her to see him as something other than an invalid. "You want honesty?" he said. "I don't know who I am anymore. For 30 years I was my father's son, then my territory's duke, then the crown's weapon in the north. I defined myself by titles and obligations. But when I rode after you, I wasn't any of those things. I was just a man who couldn't stand the thought of living in a world where you didn't exist." Tears ran down her face, silent and steady. "So if you're asking which version is real," he continued, "the answer is, I'm figuring it out the same way you are, by making choices and seeing what survives afterward." "And what choice are you making now?" He reached out and took her hand, noting how perfectly her fingers fit between his. "That's not my choice alone to make anymore. We're in this together. So I'm asking you, do you want to go back to Blackmore, live in that fortress, raise our child in marble halls and political intrigue?" She was quiet for a long time, staring at their joined hands. "I grew up wanting to matter," she said finally, "to be more than just decorative. When I came to Blackmore, I thought proximity to power would give me that, but the last 2 months have taught me that mattering has nothing to do with how many people know your name. Then what does it have to do with? How many people you'd die for? And how many would die for you?" She looked up at him. "I don't need marble halls or political influence. I just need you and our child, and the chance to build something that's ours instead of inheriting something that belongs to history." Cassian felt something shift in his chest, a fundamental realignment of priorities that had been building since the moment he'd chosen to chase her into the wilderness. "Then we take the pension and disappear," he said. "We become commoners in some eastern township where nobody knows the Iron Duke ever existed. You'd give up everything you've worked for?" "I already did. This is just making it official." She leaned forward and kissed him, slow and deliberate, and for the first time in months it felt like something other than desperation or fear. It felt like choosing rather than reacting. When she pulled back, she was smiling through tears. "We're going to be terrible at being common," she said. "Probably. But we'll figure it out, right?" The king took the news with grace that suggested he'd expected it. He summoned Cassian to a private audience 6 weeks after the assembly, in a room that was comfortable rather than ceremonial. Aldrich sat behind a desk cluttered with papers and reports, looking more like a clerk than a monarch. "So you've chosen exile," the king said when Cassian explained his decision. "I've chosen freedom. There's a difference." "Is there?" "You're giving up power and influence. That sounds like loss disguised as philosophy." "Maybe. But I've learned that power is just another kind of prison. You're locked into expectations and obligations and the constant calculation of how each action affects everyone else. I'm tired of living in that cell." Aldrich smiled sadly. "Then you're smarter than I am. I'm still locked in, and I don't see a way out that doesn't involve abdication or death. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe some of us are built for those cells, and some of us aren't. And which one am I? The kind who stays because someone has to, The kind who understands that the cage serves a purpose even if it's uncomfortable. The king was quiet for a moment, studying Cassian with an expression that suggested reassessment. You would have made a good advisor. Honest to the point of cruelty, but honest nonetheless. Find someone else who bleeds for honesty. They're rare, but they exist. I'll try. Aldrich pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. This is the pension agreement. 50,000 crowns, delivered in installments over 10 years. Enough to live comfortably in the eastern provinces without attracting attention. In exchange, you agree never to use the Vale name or claim any titles associated with it. Cassian read through the document carefully, noting the clauses and conditions. It was generous, probably more generous than he deserved. He signed it. The king countersigned and sealed it with royal insignia. Then he stood and extended his hand. Good luck, Duke Vale. Or should I say, Cassian of nowhere in particular. Just Cassian works fine. They shook hands, and Cassian felt the weight of titles and obligations fall away like discarded armor. It should have felt like diminishment. Instead, it felt like finally being able to breathe properly. One more thing, Aldrich said as Cassian turned to leave. Grand Chancellor Varric has been stripped of his position and exiled to his family estates in the southern provinces. His daughter Celine has withdrawn from court entirely. They'll likely spend the rest of their lives plotting revenge, so watch yourself. I'll keep that in mind. And Cassian? The kingdom is changing, faster than most people realize. What you did, exposing corruption at the cost of everything you valued, that's going to inspire others. There will be men and women who choose honesty over expedience because they saw you do it and survive. That's a legacy worth more than any title. Cassian nodded once and left before emotion could complicate the moment. They departed the capital 3 days later, traveling in a merchant's wagon that Isolda had purchased with the first pension payment. The wagon was sturdy but unremarkable, the kind that moved through checkpoints without attracting attention. Inside were their minimal possessions, everything they owned in the world fitting into 2 trunks and a handful of bags. Cassian drove while Isolda sat beside him, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She was 7 months pregnant now, the child making its presence known through constant movement. Sometimes Cassian would press his hand against her stomach and feel the kick, solid and real and proof that their choices had consequences beyond just themselves. They traveled east through landscape that grew progressively less familiar. Past the northern borderlands where Cassian had ruled, through neutral territories where the crown's authority was theoretical rather than practical, into provinces where people spoke with different accents, and the architecture suggested cultures that had evolved separately from the capital's influence. On the 14th day, they reached a township called Harrow's End. It sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, surrounded by farmland and forests. The buildings were a mix of stone and timber, practical rather than decorative. The people moved with the steady purpose of those who worked with their hands and slept soundly because of it. It was perfect. They purchased a small house on the edge of town with money from the pension. 2 rooms and a loft, with a well in the yard and a garden plot that previous owners had abandoned. Nothing grand, nothing that would attract attention or whisper of former nobility. Cassian stood in the empty main room and tried to imagine a life here. Tried to see himself as something other than the Iron Duke, as something smaller and more human. What do you think? Isolda asked from the doorway. I think it needs furniture. She laughed. That's not what I meant. I know. He crossed to her and pulled her close, careful of her belly. Outside, the township continued its daily routines, unaware that 2 people who'd nearly died a dozen times in the last 3 months were standing in an empty house trying to figure out how to be ordinary. I think we can be happy here, he said finally, if we choose to be. That's a very deliberate phrasing. Happiness is always deliberate. It's a decision you make every day. When did you become a philosopher? Around the same time I became unemployed. She pressed her face against his chest, and he felt her shoulders shake with what might have been laughter, or tears, or both. I'm scared, she whispered. I'm terrified that we're going to wake up one day and realize we gave up everything for a fantasy that can't survive reality. Then we deal with that when it happens. But right now, in this moment, we're alive and together and about to become parents. That's not fantasy. That's just life happening to people who decided to participate in it. The baby kicked between them, a reminder that their choices had created something new that would outlive whatever regrets they carried. Their son was born 6 weeks later during a storm that made the midwife curse the weather gods with creative profanity. Labor lasted 18 hours. Cassian sat with Isolda through all of it, holding her hand while she screamed and bled and did the brutal work of bringing life into the world. When the midwife finally placed the child in Isolda's arms, sticky with birth and howling with outrage at being evicted from warmth, Cassian understood something fundamental about power and legacy. Empires rose and fell, kingdoms fractured and reformed, political alliances dissolved like morning fog. But this, a child born from choice rather than obligation, this was the kind of permanence that actually mattered. "He's beautiful," Isolda said, her voice wrecked from screaming. "He looks angry. He has your disposition. God's help us all." They named him Arin, which in the old northern dialect meant one who chooses. It felt appropriate for a child born from parents who'd chosen each other over everything else the world had offered. The first months were brutal in ways that combat training hadn't prepared Cassian for. The exhaustion was comprehensive and unrelenting. The constant vigilance required to keep a tiny human alive made military campaigns look straightforward by comparison. There were nights when Arin screamed for hours, and Cassian walked the floor wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake abandoning power for this particular flavor of chaos. But there were also mornings when he'd wake to find Isolda nursing their son with early light streaming through the window, and the scene held a completeness that all his years of ruling had never achieved. One morning, 3 months after Arin's birth, Cassian was working in the garden when Torvin appeared at the gate. His oldest friend looked older, more weathered, with new scars that told stories of battles fought after Cassian had left the north. They stared at each other across the garden fence, years of friendship complicated by betrayal and survival. "You're alive," Torvin said finally. "So are you." "Barely." "Meera's people came for us exactly where your false intelligence said we'd be. We lost 8 men before we figured out what was happening and relocated." Cassian set down the spade he'd been using and walked to the fence. "I'm sorry. The information was meant to buy time, not get people killed." "I know. That's why I'm here instead of putting a knife in your back." They stood in silence for a moment, measuring each other. "How did you find me?" Cassian asked. "Followed the pension payments. It wasn't difficult if you knew what to look for." "And what do you want?" Torvin pulled out a letter sealed with wax. "This arrived at what used to be Blackmore's administrative center. It's addressed to you. I thought you'd want to see it before I burned it." Cassian took the letter and broke the seal. Inside was a single page written in elegant script he recognized as Celine Varick's handwriting. The letter was brief and poisonous, promising revenge delivered with patience and precision. It detailed exactly how she planned to destroy everything Cassian had built in his new life, how she would find his son and make sure he grew up knowing his father was a coward who chose personal happiness over duty. Cassian read it twice, then handed it back to Torvin. "Burn it." "You're not worried about threats from a woman whose father is disgraced and powerless?" "No, let her plot. Let her plan. By the time she's in a position to act on any of it, Arin will be old enough to make his own choices about his father's legacy. You've changed. I've accepted that some battles aren't worth fighting. Revenge is a game for people who have nothing better to do with their time." Torvin studied him carefully. "You're really done with all of it. The politics, the power, the whole system. Completely. And you're happy?" Cassian looked back at the small house where Isolda was probably trying to get Arin down for a nap while managing the 1,000 other small tasks that defined their daily existence. "I'm satisfied," he said, "which is better than happy. Happiness is too dependent on circumstances. Satisfaction is knowing you made choices you can live with." That's very philosophical for a man covered in garden dirt. Dirt washes off. Bad choices stay with you forever. Torvin smiled, actually smiled, and for a moment they were just two friends who'd survived impossible circumstances. "I should go," Torvin said. "The North is still unstable, and someone needs to hold it together until the king finds a new duke." "That someone being you?" "Apparently. Turns out when you're the only competent military mind left standing, people give you responsibility whether you want it or not. Congratulations on your promotion. Congratulations on your escape." They clasped forearms one last time, the gesture carrying all the weight of shared history and diverging futures. Then Torvin was gone, disappearing back down the road toward a world of politics and power that Cassian no longer belonged to. He went back to the garden and continued working, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind processed the conversation. Part of him wanted to feel regret for everything he'd given up. The influence, the authority, the ability to shape events on a kingdom-wide scale. But mostly he felt relief. Relief that someone else was carrying that weight now. Relief that his choices had finally aligned with his values, instead of constantly existing in tension with them. Relief that when Arryn was old enough to ask questions about his father, Cassian could answer honestly instead of hiding behind political necessity. 5 years passed like water through open fingers. Arryn grew from infant to child, developing a personality that was equal parts Cassian's stubbornness and Isolda's sharp intelligence. He asked endless questions about everything, approaching the world with curiosity that refused to be satisfied with simple answers. Cassian worked various trades around Harrow's End, discovering talents he'd never had opportunity to develop while ruling. He was good with his hands, could fix broken tools and construct furniture that was sturdy, if not elegant. The work was physical and immediate, offering satisfaction that political maneuvering had never provided. Isolde became the township's unofficial record keeper, her organizational skills and literacy making her valuable to a community where most people couldn't write their own names. She kept birth records and property deeds, mediated disputes, and gradually became the person people turned to when they needed problems solved. They built a life that was small and complete, but the past never stays buried forever. It arrived one autumn morning in the form of a royal messenger wearing crown insignia. The entire township gathered to watch this unusual visitor approach Cassian's house, whispers spreading about what it might mean. Cassian met the messenger at his gate, Arryn hiding behind his legs and Isolda standing in the doorway with an expression that suggested she was preparing for the worst. The messenger dismounted and handed Cassian a sealed letter with formal ceremony. By order of King Aldrich III, this summons commands your presence at the capital within 30 days. Cassian broke the seal and read quickly. The letter was brief and lacked the political language that usually padded royal communications. Cassian, I need your help. The kingdom is fracturing again, and I'm out of people I can trust. I'm not asking you to reclaim titles or return to your old life. I'm asking for advice from someone who chose honesty over expedience. Come to the capital. Bring your family if you want. Stay as long as you're willing. But please come. Aldrich. He read it twice, then looked at Isolda. She crossed the yard and read over his shoulder, her expression shifting from concern to something more complicated. Are you going? She asked. I don't know. He does need help. You can hear it in how he's writing. That doesn't make it our problem, doesn't it, though? We escaped the system, but the system still affects everyone we left behind. If the kingdom fractures into civil war, Harrow's End doesn't stay neutral. Nobody does. So we go back to save people who would have executed us 5 years ago? We go back to help someone who gave us the choice to leave in the first place. Cassian looked down at Arryn, who was staring up at him with wide eyes. What do you think? He asked his son. Should we visit the capital? What's the capital like? Big, loud, full of people who think they're more important than they actually are. Sounds terrible. It is. But sometimes terrible places need good people to make them less terrible. Arryn considered this with the seriousness of a 5-year-old philosopher. Then we should go. Because you're a good person. The simple certainty in his son's voice made something tighten in Cassian's chest. He looked at the messenger. Tell the king we'll be there. March. They arrived at the capital 28 days later, traveling in the same wagon they'd left in 5 years ago. The city had changed in subtle ways. More guards at the checkpoints. Fewer merchants in the market squares. The architecture was the same, but the atmosphere was different, tense and watchful. The king received them in a private chamber rather than the throne room, dressed simply and looking like he'd aged a decade in 5 years. When Aldrich saw Cassian, relief flooded his expression. You came, the king said. You asked. I wasn't sure you would. After everything that happened, I thought you might prefer to stay hidden. Hidden isn't the same as gone, and you said you needed help. Aldrich gestured for them to sit, his movements carrying exhaustion that went bone deep. The kingdom is falling apart, not dramatically, just slowly, like a building with structural damage that everyone pretends not to see. The southern provinces are consolidating power independently. The northern lords are fragmented and suspicious. Every policy I propose gets blocked by factions who are more interested in undermining each other than actually governing. Sounds familiar? It's worse than when Theron was in power. At least then there was a clear enemy to oppose. Now it's just chaos with no direction. So what do you need from me? The king looked at him directly. I need you to do what you did 5 years ago. Tell me the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Help me see the patterns I'm missing because I'm too close to the situation. That's what advisors are for. My advisors are politicians. They tell me what advances their interests. You're the only person I know who burned his entire career down for the sake of honesty. Cassian glanced at Isolda, who was listening with careful attention. Arryn sat between them, remarkably well-behaved for a child in the presence of royalty. I'm not coming back permanently, Cassian said. I'm not reclaiming titles or positions, but I'll stay for a month, give you what perspective I can. After that, I go back to Harrow's End and you find someone else to tell you uncomfortable truths. A month is better than nothing. And you understand I'm going to be blunt to the point of offensive? I'm counting on it. They talked for hours. Cassian, listening to the king describe the intricate web of competing interests and political paralysis. Isolda contributed observations about patterns she noticed, her intelligence cutting through complexity with surgical precision. Even Arryn asked questions occasionally, his child's perspective somehow illuminating aspects the adults had overlooked. By the time they finished, Aldrich looked simultaneously more hopeful and more overwhelmed. You're going to tell me the whole system needs rebuilding, aren't you? The king said. The whole system needs burning down and starting over. But since that's not practical, yes. Fundamental restructuring is the minimum requirement. Where do I even start? Cassian leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of knowledge earned through failure and survival. You start by admitting that the current structure serves the people who benefit from it, rather than the kingdom as a whole. You identify which lords are actually interested in governance versus which ones are just protecting their territories. Then you break the informal alliances that have calcified into obstacles and rebuild around competence instead of lineage. That's going to create enemies. Everything creates enemies. The question is whether you're creating them for good reasons or bad ones. The king smiled tiredly. This is why I needed you. Everyone else dances around these truths. You just lay them out like you're discussing the weather. Because it is that simple. Not easy, but simple. The complexity is just cover for people who benefit from confusion. They talked late into the night, laying out strategies and identifying key pressure points. When they finally broke for rest, Cassian felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. The satisfaction of using his mind for something larger than himself. It was dangerous, that satisfaction. It whispered that maybe he could do this permanently, could reclaim some version of his old life while maintaining his hard-won freedom. But when he returned to the rooms the king had provided and found Isolda putting Arryn to bed, he remembered why he'd left in the first place. This moment, reading stories to his son in a borrowed room, was more real than any political victory could ever be. And reality, he'd learned, was worth protecting even at the cost of significance. The month stretched into 6 weeks, then 2 months. Cassian found himself genuinely useful in ways he hadn't anticipated. His outsider perspective combined with insider knowledge created a unique position that neither the king's traditional advisors nor the reform-minded newcomers could match. He helped restructure the advisory council, breaking up the old guard's stranglehold while preventing the reformers from implementing changes too quickly for the system to absorb. He mediated disputes between northern and southern factions, using his history with both to find compromise that felt less like surrender and more like pragmatism. Slowly, incrementally, the kingdom began to stabilize, but Cassian could feel the pull of his other life growing stronger. Harrow's End called to him in quiet moments, promising simplicity that the capital would never offer. Isolda felt it too. He could see it in the way she watched Arryn play in the palace gardens, her expression suggesting she was calculating the cost of staying versus leaving. On the 80th day, Cassian requested a final audience with the king. Aldrich received him in the same private chamber where they'd first talked, looking healthier than he had in months. The immediate crisis had passed. The kingdom was still fragile, but it was functional, which was better than it had been. "You're leaving," the king said. It wasn't a question. It's time. The kingdom still needs you. The kingdom needs someone like me. That doesn't have to be me specifically. Aldrich walked to the window and stared out at the capital spreading in all directions. I've been thinking about what you said that first night, about how the system serves the people who benefit from it. You were right. I've spent 5 years trying to fix a structure that's designed to resist change. So what are you going to do about it? I'm going to tear it down. Not literally, but fundamentally. I'm going to call a grand assembly and propose a new structure of governance. One where power is distributed based on competence and accountability rather than lineage and tradition. That's going to start a war. Probably. But the alternative is slow decay until someone else starts a war anyway. At least this way, it's on terms I choose. Cassian studied the king carefully. When we first met, you were trapped in a cage of your own making. Now you're choosing to break out. That's growth or stupidity. The line is thin. Every meaningful change looks like stupidity until it succeeds. The king turned from the window and extended his hand. Thank you. For coming when I asked, for telling me truths I didn't want to hear, for showing me that choosing honesty doesn't have to mean choosing destruction. They shook hands, and Cassian felt the finality of it. This was goodbye in a way that was absolute. Whatever happened next in the capital, he wouldn't be part of it. And that was exactly right. They left the capital the next morning, wagon packed with gifts from grateful advisors and a sealed letter from the king that Aldrich said to open only when Cassian needed reassurance that his choices had mattered. The journey back to Harrow's End took 15 days. They traveled through landscape that had once felt foreign but now felt like coming home. The mountains rising in familiar patterns. The forests arranged in ways Cassian had memorized without realizing it. The township appearing in the valley like something inevitable and chosen. Their house stood exactly as they'd left it, preserved by neighbors who'd maintained the garden and kept the roof from leaking. Coming back felt less like returning and more like completing a circle that had started when they'd first fled Blackmore. That night, after Arryn was asleep and the house was quiet, Cassian and Isolde sat on the porch watching stars appear in gaps between clouds. "Do you regret it?" Isolde asked. "Leaving the capital? You were making a real difference." "I made a difference. Past tense. Now it's someone else's turn. But you could have stayed, could have been part of reshaping the kingdom. At what cost? Arryn growing up in marble halls learning to calculate every relationship as a transaction? Us becoming the people we left behind? I didn't sacrifice everything just to end up right back where I started." She leaned against his shoulder. "I'm glad you chose this. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure either. Part of me wanted to stay. Wanted to reclaim some version of who I used to be, and why didn't you? Because I finally understand the difference between significance and meaning. Significance is about how many people know your name. Meaning is about the depth of connection with the people who matter. I'd rather have meaning." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that came from people who'd survived impossible circumstances and chosen each other repeatedly. Somewhere in the distance, Harrow's End settled into night rhythms. Farmers finishing evening chores, merchants closing shops. The steady heartbeat of a community that would continue regardless of what happened in distant capitals. Cassian felt something settle in his chest that he'd been chasing for 5 years without recognizing it. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of alignment between values and actions. He'd been the Iron Duke, feared and respected across 8 provinces. Now he was just Cassian, a man who fixed tools and raised his son and loved his wife with a ferocity that made empires look fragile by comparison. It wasn't the life he'd been trained for. It wasn't the legacy his father would have recognized, but it was his, and that made it worth every sacrifice, every wound, every moment of terror and uncertainty that had brought him here. Years later, when Arryn was old enough to understand, Cassian would tell him the story, not as a tale of heroism or political intrigue, but as a lesson about choice and consequence, about how power was just another kind of cage, and freedom meant accepting that significance was less important than authenticity. He would tell his son that real strength wasn't measured in how many people feared you or how much territory you controlled. It was measured in your willingness to walk away from everything you'd built when it stopped serving who you wanted to become. He would tell him that love wasn't weakness disguised as emotion. It was the clearest form of strength, because choosing another person meant accepting vulnerability and interdependence in a world that taught you to be isolated and invulnerable. But tonight, with Isolda warm against his shoulder and stars appearing overhead, and the simple satisfaction of being exactly where he chose to be, Cassian didn't think about lessons or legacy. He just existed, present, alive, free. And if empires rose and fell without his involvement, if kingdoms fractured and reformed without his counsel, If history moved forward and forgot the Iron Duke entirely, that was perfectly fine, because he'd learned the most important truth that power never teaches, that mattering to everyone means nothing if you don't matter to anyone. And he mattered here, to Isolda, to Arryn, to the neighbors who borrowed tools and returned them fixed, to the community that had accepted two fugitives without asking questions about their past. He mattered in ways that were small and complete and real. And after 30 years of chasing significance, real was exactly what he needed.